Hi, my name is Chris Brennan, and you're listening to the Astrology Podcast. Today is Saturday, January 23rd, 2021, starting at 1:09 p.m. in Denver, Colorado. And I think this is going to be something like the 290th episode of the show, but I'm not sure yet. So I'm going to be talking today with astrologer Ronnie Gale Dreyer, and we're going to be looking at the early history of the north and south node of the moon, both in Western as well as in Indian astrology over the course of the past 2,000 years. So, hey, Ronnie, thank you for joining me today.
Oh, it's great to be here. It's been a long time in coming.
Yeah, I think we've been working on workshopping this episode for like a year now, off and on, and writing different outlines and things like that, and doing different historical research about the origins of the nodes in Indian astrology and in Western astrology. But we're finally doing it, and I think this is going to be a good discussion. So let's jump into it first. I wanted to introduce you to my audience. So you're the author of the 1997 book, Vedic Astrology, A Guide to the Fundamentals of Jyotish, which is an intro book on Indian astrology that I know a lot of people got their start with when it comes to Indian astrology, and that's something that you specialize in, is Indian astrology, in addition to having a background in Western astrology at the same time, right?
Yeah. Yeah, that was one of the first, the very first incarnation of that book was called Indian Astrology. And Indian Astrology, I believe it was called A Western Approach to the Ancient Art. I don't even remember anymore my exact subtitle. And then the book got revised and reissued. And I had already written a book on Venus, which was, it's a Western book about the goddess, and I'm trying to revise that one too. But yeah, the Vedic Astrology book was one of the early ones, along with James Braha, David Frawley, a whole bunch of us who did beginning texts.
Right. So you're one of the first waves of like modern practitioners of modern Western astrology that had been studying Western astrology for a few decades, but then you got into studying Indian astrology. And that was like a whole movement that really started in what, like the 1980s and early 90s?
Well, earlier than that, there had been somebody, a few people who had written some books. Robert Deleuze wrote the first very big book called Constellational Astrology. I don't know if you can still get it. And he wrote that in, I believe, the late 60s. But in the 70s was the big wave when people started going to India. They went to India to learn music, went to ashrams. Some people just went because you could actually get on a bus, as I did. This is all in the introduction to my book, but you could get on a bus. I was living in Holland and Greece. I went to Greece, and then I took a bus. It was called the Magic Bus, and it went all the way to India, and it went through Turkey, Iran, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and through India. And you could do it in those days. And many of us, James Braha had the same experience, David Frawley, myself, Nalini. There were a whole bunch of people, and we just learned astrology. We found a teacher and did it. And so that was the mid-70s. And then we came back, a lot of us, and then other people went in the early 80s. James Braha's book was published in 1986. And my first book was published in 1990, the Indian Astrology book, as was David Frawley's. Yeah. So.
Okay. Yeah. And then not long after, I think a few years later, the American Council of Vedic Astrology was formed, so that you guys started forming some actual organizations for the practice of Indian astrology in the U.S.
Yeah. They had Dennis Harness and David Frawley and somebody else named Stephen Kwong. They had their very first conference in 1992 in San Rafael. And Dennis, as myself and James Braha, we all had studied Western astrology. And we met in D.C. at UAC in 1992. And a lot of us were invited to go to this conference. And suddenly we all met people who, like ourselves, Westerners who had studied in India, and also people who studied here, because a lot of the spiritual movements, like the TM movement, astrology Maharishi brought a lot of astrology there and encouraged people to learn astrology.
And then transcendental meditation.
Right, transcendental meditation, TM.
Okay.
and also Yogananda's group, and they also do it and still do it. A lot of people practice astrology, and we learned about all these other people. I mean, suddenly I met all these people. I had no idea that there was a huge bunch of people who were practicing Indian astrology, because I was in New York, the only one I knew, except for Indians, who had been doing it for many, many years. So it was great. And then that kind of snowballed and developed, over many years.
Yeah, that 1992 lineup I always thought was striking, because I always put it in my chronologies when I talk about the significance of the Uranus-Neptune conjunction that was happening around that time, and how that United Astrology Conference in 1992 was also when Project Hindsight started getting going. And so the whole revival of traditional astrology really exploded not long after that time, traditional Western astrology, and that it was interesting that there's this movement to create the organization, or some organizations and different things surrounding the practice of Indian astrology at the same time. So it was kind of like a parallel development that was almost happening in tandem.
Well, what happened also was, the interesting thing was, a lot of this happened at the 92 UAC.
Right.
In DC, because
Yeah.
that was, I believe, when Robert Schmidt and Zoller and Hand, they really were talking about, let's do something,
Mhm.
And then, of course, some of us, I mean, there was no Indian astrology track at UAC. I mean,
Okay.
I was the coordinator of the first one in 95, but we were all there meeting each other. And then the hindsight, that the conclave that I went to in 95, right, the first conclave was 94, and then 95 was the second one, and that was very focused on Indian astrology and tradition and classical Western. K.N. Rao was at that conclave, and there was a whole meeting of the two traditions, because they have so much in common. I mean, they transmitted so much knowledge between them, and we all discovered really that classical Western astrology, or Hellenistic astrology, had more in common with Indian astrology than modern Western astrology had in common with classical Western. So there
Right.
was so many things. It was wonderful, that conclave. Actually, I met Demetra there, and who was one of my close friends, as you know, Demetra George. Susie Cox was there. The Neguses were there. I mean, everybody was at that conclave. It was great.
Yeah, I mean, all
it
of
was
that sounded
wonderful.
like really amazing times, just in terms of having all those threads of ancient astrology really come pouring out in different ways during that time frame. So that's relevant to what we're talking about today. And so,
Mhm.
just a complete part of your story, not to give your entire biography, but you went back to school and you've been studying Sanskrit, and some of the things that you've been working on over the past decade are translating some texts from Sanskrit into English, so from some ancient Indian texts. And one of them that you've been working on is one on like women's birth chart astrology in ancient India, right?
Well, that was my master's thesis. So I went back to school in 2008. And again, Demetra George was one of my inspirations, because she had gone back to school to get a master's degree as well in classics.
Right.
And she gave me some wonderful hints about how to actually do that, go back to school, what to do, what not to do.
A lot of
And
astrologers did that. It seemed like in the
I
past
know.
couple of decades, you guys went back to college and got advanced degrees and studied like ancient languages and stuff in order to further your work in astrology.
Yeah. I mean, mostly I had wanted to go back to school for a long time. I didn't know what I wanted to do. And then suddenly I realized that Columbia was here, and that was a school that taught Sanskrit. Not every school in the country does. And when I went back to school, I had to start like at the very beginning, and then I applied for a master's degree. And my thesis was translating doing a commentary on 5 chapters in the text that now I'm involved with doing some translating work. For short, I'll call it VYJ, but it's called Vrida Yavana Jataka, and it's never been translated into English. And the 5 chapters I did were on women's astrology. And since then, I've been working with a few other scholars, and of course, I'm not even near them. But I think they need me more for the astrology, and they're really much better in the Sanskrit. But the translation, sometimes, as you know, with classical works, you have to find like the right words to kind of give you the idea of what the ancients were trying to convey. So, and I kind of just wanted to do that. I wanted to go back to school to learn it because some of the Indian translations are awful, so I really wanted to kind of for myself see
What's
some
the
of it.
dating on that text, and what's the focus of those chapters?
So the Vriddha Jataka, David Pingree dated the Yavana Jataka, which is the astrology of the Greeks, and he dated it to about 269-70. He thought it was also first done in about 149 CE, and then Spujadvaja took it and put it into meter. A few other scholars now are doubting whether there was that original text that came from Alexandria because it disappeared. But the idea of that Greek astrology was transmitted, and that is when horoscopic astrology started, was definitely probably around the 3rd and 4th centuries. Vriddha Jataka Pingree dated as between 320 and 325 CE. But there are a lot of people who think that the Vriddha Jataka was first. So people are kind of trying to redate things, but right now that's kind of like the approximate dating of it, and it's much larger than Yavana Jataka. It's like 71 chapters, so it's a big it's a big effort to translate.
In the Greek tradition, they will sometimes default to the delineations are given by default for men, and then occasionally they'll say, however, in the charts of women, you have to look at it like this, or in some instances where there's not a difference, they'll just say, and you apply the same techniques just the same way in the charts of women. So what's different about those chapters that you worked on that make them specifically for women?
Those chapters specifically, and every text that came after that, some of the classical texts that most people who study Indian astrology are familiar with, will have a chapter called Stri Jataka. Jataka is astrology, and Stri is the word for feminine or woman. And what these chapters did, there were absolutely 5 chapters. So the first, one has to do with the ascendants. If you have the ascendant in this sign, it's good or bad. And of course, the relationship to women is that the fire and air signs are bad, the earth and water signs are good. And then the next chapter is the moon in each of the signs. The third chapter in this women's series is about the nakshatras. And then the fourth one are the planets in the houses. And the fifth one is the Raja Yogas, which is combinations for royalty or wealth. So most of it is you can marry a man who has, you can be a pauper or you can be very low caste. And if you have this Raja Yoga, you'll still marry a man. And then there's a chapter in the text for nakshatras for men. You don't have that in the later texts. So in the later text, you'll have one chapter on nakshatras, one chapter on the moon in the houses. But then you do have, as in the Hellenistic tradition, a chapter on women's astrology that says the same thing, that if you don't apply this to the astrology in the book, that you can apply it to the woman. Otherwise, default it to what is given in the text, so that if it's the moon through the houses, you can apply it to your chart as well. But there's a lot of very different things as you go on. The women's astrology is very different than the 5 chapters that I translated. They're about many different things. A lot of them are about menstrual cycles, what is the chart of your first menstruation? What does that say about womanhood, and how are you going to marry, and if you're widowed? So it's a little bit of a different tradition than what I translated. And I can't really find anything preceding that, which I'm trying to actually, that it came from. There are Egyptian texts, demotic texts, that people are now translating. There's a huge project in Germany. A lot of papyri are being translated, and they're finding there that there's things about women's astrology. So it might be interesting to see if it came from demotic texts.
So there were specific technical things that they were doing differently when interpreting women's charts. And one of the questions I had, maybe you know the answer, maybe you don't, but in the Western tradition, I've been trying to document and identify who were the first like there's references to women seeing astrologers as clients in the 1st century. And then there's, Hypatia in like the 5th century is the first woman that we know of by name that probably had some training in astrology, but we're not really sure if she was an astrologer necessarily. Her father was a famous astronomer. And then it's not until like the 9th century that, Kenneth Johnson wrote that paper 10 years ago in an NCGR journal about Buran of Baghdad being one of the first women that we know of who had training in astrology, and she was associated with a famous prediction where she supposedly saved the king at the time from an assassination attempt using astrological means, which is kind of like a legendary story, but she's the first woman that we know of by name that we can name as an astrologer. Do you know in the Indian tradition if there's any comparable figures, or at what point, we start seeing women who are practitioners of astrology in any general sense or specific sense?
Absolutely. That's a fascinating question because I have no idea. I mean, these texts that were written, Astrology for Women, we presume that they're written for men, fathers who want to marry off their daughters, men who want to find wives, that they're not necessarily written for women, even though there were, of course, a lot of Brahmin women who were very well read and educated. But there's really, not to my knowledge anyway, any texts that were written by women, or really addressed to women, even though there is astrology for women. And it's interesting as you even move into the modern era. I knew so many astrologers from India over the years who told me about the fact that they learned from their mothers. And their mothers were brilliant astrologers, but they did not do it for a living because in India, a lot of the traditional astrology, I mean, the beauty about India is that it's an unbroken tradition. So you get families that, are giving their knowledge to their children and their grandchildren, and all that. And a lot of the children are taking over, they used to anyway, you take over your father's profession. And they had libraries full of books and notes and charts. I mean, amazing things that you'll never find in an academic library. And a lot of those men who hung their shingles, I mean, people I learned in India, it was the same thing. Their sons were going to take over the practice, but their wives were brilliant astrologers, and some of them were brilliant Sanskritists. And in fact, I went to a lecture a few years ago where a woman, a professor, was doing a survey in India and found that because so many not just men, but now, of course, a lot of women are highly educated and are doctors and IT people. They're all choosing that profession, but there are still the people who are choosing to study humanities and languages are all women, because they're not thinking necessarily of material and being successful in the corporate world or the material world. So it's fascinating that there are a lot of women, I'm assuming even back in the first millennium, second millennia, who did study astrology. But by name, I don't know. It'd be fascinating to find them.
Yeah, I mean, especially in traditions, I always think even back to the Mesopotamian period where you have families of astrologers and like family lineages of people handing it down from generation to generation, and it's staying within families partially as an oral tradition and maybe partially as a written tradition, that there must have been, women or daughters who learned astrology as part of that or from their fathers or what have you as part of that tradition, even if we don't have names or like texts that survive from them. But certainly in the modern period, in like the 20th century, there's become like famous women who are astrologers from India. Like I think Gayatri Devi Vastu, who's the daughter of B.V. Raman, has taken over his editorship of Modern Astrology magazine, right?
Mm-hmm. Well, the children, now there are two magazines. One son took over that magazine, and then Gayatri, I think, created another. So they kind of they inherited B.V. Raman's, libraries and knowledge, of course. And Gayatri really was the one who practiced a lot and was kind of her father's apprentice. She's a brilliant astrologer, and she's the one who they will call up to time events, politicians and inaugurations, prime ministers, because they all use astrology to time their events, or they try to anyway. And she's the one they'll call because she was affiliated with B.V. Raman, who, for those who don't know, I mean, he was the one who modernized and made popular Indian astrology. He had a magazine. He wrote a lot of books. So he, you say B.V. Raman and everybody knows who he was.
Okay. Yeah, I think I read one of her books on horary or on prajna was one of the ones that Dennis recommended that was very good when I was studying Indian astrology at Kepler. All right, so we're getting way off track. I want to, because that was a really interesting discussion because I wanted to have, but let's get to our primary discussion and let me set up the premise. So the premise of this discussion about the nodes today is that I realized many years ago that some of the modern meanings of the nodes are actually pretty recent. And this is something I discussed in episode 137 with Adam Summer, where we got on this long digression about the nodes. And specifically, in particular, the idea that the south node represents your past life in the birth chart, or that the north node represents your future life in a birth chart, that's become kind of ingrained in some schools of modern astrology over the past few decades. But if you look back further than the past 3 or 4 decades, you don't see that as much. And if you go past, like the earliest reference I can find to that, and the guy that seems to have introduced it as far as I can tell, is Dane Rudhyar in his 1936 book, The Astrology of Personality. And then there's another really crucial book by Martin Schulman on the nodes from like the 1970s that takes the concept further. And some astrologers like Stephen Forrest, for example, told me that he was really influenced by Schulman's book in then taking that further with the evolutionary astrology schools, where they really focus on the nodes having to do with past and future lives. So, but if you go back further than that in the Western tradition, I realized that that concept just completely disappears, indicating that it's more recent. And one of the issues is that most modern astrologers just assume that because they know that ideas of like karma and reincarnation existed in the Indian tradition, they assume that Indian astrologers must have associated past lives with the South Node as well. But in fact, if you look at the Indian tradition prior to the past few decades, that concept is also completely absent, is my understanding, as well. So it's not something that came from the Indian tradition. So that being the case, then I wanted to talk about with you today what the nodes did indicate prior to modern times, both in the Western tradition as well as in the Indian astrological tradition, and talk about where some of the ancient or traditional meanings of the nodes came from. So that's kind of the premise of this discussion. Do you agree, for the most part, with how I set it up in that, for example, is it a true statement in having studied the Indian tradition that they don't, prior to modern times, tend to associate the nodes with like past lives?
Well, so the first thing I have to say is that even though we're talking about the Indian tradition, there are a lot of different lineages. So this is one of the mistakes that people do make. I mean, I'm not saying you make mistakes because I make that mistake all the time, but there are a lot of different lineages, and a lot of people use the lineage that they're taught. So it's a very guru student, tradition in India, and that's really how you learn. You find a teacher. There are texts, of course. And a lot of the texts will talk about the whole chart as being a chart of reincarnation, because karma and reincarnation, the whole idea of what's called samsara, is kind of vital to the thought process. And because of that, and even some of the classical texts like Brihat Jataka will begin, and Vriddhi Avanajataka VYJ, they begin the first chapter says that the chart, the horoscope, is it's like a mirror. You look at it and it tells you where you came from, and now you are going to work things out. There are some traditions, however, that do say that the South Node does represent your past life, and Rahu or the North Node represents the karma you're creating in this life. But they're not negating the fact that the rest of the horoscope also has to do with past lives. So anything that you look at, the 5th house, the 9th house, those are all houses that tell you what you've inherited from another life, because they are the houses of good fortune. The 9th house is the house of dharma, and the 5th house is the house of things that you've gotten from another life. But in the texts themselves, it doesn't say particularly that Ketu is past and Rahu is the future. Any planet in a certain position could indicate what your past is, because it's just something that the whole horoscope indicates. Whatever it is. So
that's my understanding of Indian astrology, is that the entire chart represents your karma and
exactly
things that are carried over, inherited from past lives. But I just want to go back to something you just said, because that's not my understanding in reading any actual translations of Indian text at this point, is that I've not seen an Indian text prior to modern times. So there are some modern texts, for example, by Camilla Sutton, where it seems like they're taking the Western notion of associating the nodes with past and future lives and starting to integrate that within the context of Indian astrology. But it's not something that's coming from the actual Indian tradition itself, of anything that I've seen from like Parashara or the Jataka itself or anything like that. So, because I don't want to, but we should clarify that, because I think that you saying that might have blown up the premise of this discussion. So I want to clarify that before we move on.
No, what I'm saying is that in the texts themselves, the texts that we have that have been translated, there's nothing in there. And in fact, some of the texts don't even use Rahu Ketu. That's why I was saying to you that later on, they started using Rahu Ketu in the horoscope. The early texts do not even use Rahu Ketu in horoscopic astrology. So it took quite a few years, which we'll get into. What I was trying to say was that there are some lineages and some traditions that you're not going to read in the book, who teach from their gurus and from their teacher that the South Node does represent the past and the North Node the future. It's not like a blanket thing that you're not going to find it anywhere, but they're not in the texts. I think that's the thing that is that you have to kind of understand about the Indian tradition, that you're going to find different lineages that are not in books. And then if you see a teacher at a conference or see him, he will say, let's say South Node can give you the past and the North Node the future. But you're not necessarily going to read it in a book. Now, that is going to be his tradition that maybe he learned from his teacher. So I think that that's the other thing with an oral tradition, is that there are a lot of things that are in the texts, but then there's a lot of things that aren't in the texts. I was not taught that the South Node is the past and the North Node is the future. That's not something I was taught in India, and it wasn't anything I found in the text. All I'm saying is that there are some teachers. In fact, I'm bringing this up only because Camilla is actually having a conference this weekend, and I heard one of the Indian teachers talk about the nodes as being South Node being past karma and North Node being future. And I
think that's something that's coming from the Western tradition, though. I don't want to get stuck on that too much, but that's basically the premise of this entire discussion. Is I've never met any Indian astrologer that was drawing on the older tradition that used that past and future life premise, that wasn't getting that from influence that they were taking from the modern Western tradition. Because we just don't see that prior to the 20th century. It comes out of nowhere, and it's coming out of the theosophists for the most part, who picked up and then ran with this concept, starting with Rudhyar. But that's pretty much the entire premise of this discussion. So I just want to make sure, I don't know.
No, what I'm saying, no, I agree that they're in the text, but my point is that when you take India, what you have to take into consideration is that there are a lot of things that you are not going to see in the libraries or the books. If you meet somebody or meet a teacher, he will tell you things and you will not have a clue where they came from. Some of them come from Nadi texts that are not even translated. So that's why Indian astrology is so complex, because you get these families and these traditions. So that's my point, that if you're talking about theosophists, the theosophists were based in India. I mean, that's where it started, the whole theosophy movement. So when things come into it, you don't always know exactly where they're coming from in terms of an actual year or an actual text. So our discussion is still completely valid. That's my point, because most of us are learning from those texts that we're getting. But most of us in this day and age are not running to India anymore. I mean, that was, way, way, way in the past. And you will get through, of course, social media, the internet, you can meet many, many Indian astrologers now. So my point is that you're going to hear a lot of things that people tell you, and you're going to say, well, where is it coming from? And they're going to say to you, well, it's coming from my mother, or it's coming from my uncle, or it's coming from the parampara, which is the, kind of tradition. So I guess that was my point that I wanted to make. But what we were discussing before, we were talking about this, has to do with the books that you will read from, and that were the texts that were available to the general public. They will not tell you that one planet in particular has to do with your past life, or one planet in particular will have to do with the future. It will be the entire chart. So that is true. That's true. I was just adding that. I didn't mean to confuse you or negate, because it doesn't negate anything we're saying at all.
Well, so I guess we have to do the digression about interactions between Eastern and Western astrology and the continual sending back and forth of different doctrines and rubbing off on each other that astrologers do periodically just in the history of astrology, which is that anytime you put two astrologers in a room together, they'll begin to talk and compare notes and compare and contrast techniques. And sometimes they'll have overlaps, and sometimes they'll have areas of major disagreement. But through that interaction, there's often some sort of exchange that takes place. And this is one of the crucial factors about the history and transmission of astrology, is that astrologers are constantly trading techniques from each other and sending them back and forth from language to language and culture to culture over history. So one of the only ways that we can tell what was happening during specific eras and try to date and do chronologies of like what techniques were used when is by looking at the textual evidence of what are the astrologers saying at different points about the techniques that they use and how they're conceptualizing different things.
Mm-hmm.
So part of our discussion today is just going to be about going back and talking about the earliest ways that the astrologers are discussing the nodes and how that grew and developed and changed over time in both the Eastern and Western tradition until we get to modern times where things become a little bit different.
Mm-hmm. I didn't mean to throw you off. The reason I brought it up was only because this podcast goes out to so many people. And right now there's so much information that people are getting from the internet and from different teachers, some valid and some not valid. But the many Indian teachers who, are kind of sitting in India or don't have huge websites or, YouTube channels or anything like that, are practicing their astrology. And they will have their own tradition, as I said, from families and things like that. But when we are talking now about the whole idea of the texts and the textual tradition, that is still completely valid about the nodes and how we conceptualize them.
Yeah,
So.
and for me, what's important and one of the main things I wanted to do with this episode is clarify what the traditional Indian views
Mm-hmm.
were on the nodes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think applying ideas of past and future lives to those is not a traditional concept that was done prior to the past century. So honoring the Indian tradition for me was going to be part of looking back and seeing how they actually did talk about it in the textual tradition versus just taking some of those Western concepts that are being put on top of it sort of for granted.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that when if you want to go back to, the nodes, as I was saying to you when we were talking about this over the last year, is that you really have two, what I call interwoven threads. You have the 9 planets, which were called Navagraha, and of course, Sun through Saturn, and then Rahu Ketu. Rahu is the north node, Ketu is the south node. And these were honored or propitiated in order to wipe away any evil that the planets would bring, because they were these forces that, before they were used in horoscopic astrology, were looked at as, the forces that had to be appeased. And the nodes were available. People were talking about Rahu as the maker of eclipses, because the nodes are very, very, very close to the sun and moon when you have an eclipse. So the whole idea of Rahu as a demon, let's say, was there from the Vedic times, from the time of the Vedas. But this is before horoscopic astrology, and so Rahu became this demon. And once the horoscopic astrology started to materialize in the early, 3rd century, 4th century, what happened was they decided to appease them, and then also have what's called pujas to honor them, or rituals. And they became part of what's called the Navagraha Mandala. So they were 9 planets, and they were all in, similar positions. The sun was in the middle, and the other 8 were all around, each ruling a different direction, which you can find in temples now. Even any temple, Hindu temple you go to, will have a room that has all these planets, and they're going to be in the same exact positioning that they were then. And before they became anthropomorphic deities in temples, they were represented with different shapes, different colors, different things that they put on these mandalas in order to appease the planets. This was way before they became affiliated with horoscopic astrology. In the earliest texts, in Yavana Jataka, which is a text you're very familiar with from the 3rd century, there's no mention of Rahu Ketu at all. The nodes are not even in there.
Right. So that's a really important point. So part of the point is that in the early history of Indian astrology, the nodes aren't used as much as you would expect that they should be, because they become so prominent later on, but they do eventually get integrated into the tradition in Indian astrology. And also, one of the things you're saying is that the mythology behind Rahu and Ketu was originally a separate mythology that wasn't necessarily connected with the nodes, but then it later came to be connected with the nodes.
Well, Rahu was the demon that formed eclipses. And the whole idea of how Rahu became Rahu is a very well-known myth called the churning of the ocean. And the demons and the gods had to find the Amrita, which is like ambrosia. It's what you drank in order to become immortal. They had to get it out of the ocean. And they churned the ocean in order to get it. And once it came out, the demon Rahu wanted to celebrate with the gods, but they didn't want him to. So he kind of disguised himself and drank some of this Amrita, which is what the gods drank to become immortal. And then what happened was Vishnu threw his discus and decapitated Rahu. So that's how Rahu became known as, the demon, the head. But the whole idea of the myth is that Rahu was able to come out during eclipses. That was the only time he could be seen. Other than that, he was, banned from the world. But the idea of the nine grahas, which is what they called planets, was something that they used for propitiation purposes. Ketu was, which is the south node eventually, was a comet. The word Ketu means smoke, comet, formless. So in fact, they had what's called the Navagraha, but they were not even Rahu and Ketu used in the horoscopes. So there's nothing in Yavana Jataka. In Vriddha Yavana Jataka, the text from the 4th century, they're mentioned once for directional purposes. And then in Jataka, which is a major, major text in the 6th century from Varahamihira, who's a very well-known astrologer that everything kind of, came from. He did not use them either in the horoscope. So what's fascinating and what people don't realize is that even though they were used as part of this Navagraha, and they were used as part of the mandala, the altars, they were not used in astrology, in horoscopic astrology. I believe the Hellenistic period, there were some astrologers who used them, but I don't think they were used that widely either.
Sure. No, and that's an interesting parallel where the nodes are not mentioned very frequently in the early Hellenistic texts. So there are some references that go back pretty early in one of the early birth charts from like the 1st century BCE, although it may have not been cast until the 1st century CE, does contain one or both of the nodes. And then there are sporadic mentions of the nodes from Dorotheus in the 1st century CE onwards, but they don't start to get used and they're not fully integrated in the system in a major way until the time of Rhetorius at the very end of the Hellenistic tradition in like the 6th or 7th century. And with Rhetorius, it's not really clear if he's just formalizing something, if he's just articulating something that was already there earlier and he's just making it more explicit, or if the tradition had changed by that point, by the late Hellenistic tradition, so that the nodes became more important and more prominent than they were earlier, which is often an issue that we have with Rhetorius. But the two main trends that I've identified in terms of interpretations in the Hellenistic traditions when they are mentioned is one, notion of the nodes being ominous and unsettling or disruptive due to being associated with eclipses. And I suspect with this notion of there being like this interruption in nature because it's suddenly when the moon eclipses the sun, it becomes dark out in the middle of the day, which just seems like something that's almost outside of the natural order. So there's that part of the sort of negative tradition of the nodes. And then there's a secondary tradition that shows up by the time of Rhetorius, at least, of the north node having to do with increasing things and the south node having to do with decreasing things, because the nodes represent the point where the moon's latitude begins increasing and going upwards or decreasing and going downwards. And then this leads to the later medieval tradition of saying that the north node is good with the benefics because it increases them, and it's bad with the malefics because it increases their natural tendency towards maleficence. And the south node is good with the malefics because it decreases their natural tendency towards maleficence, and it's bad with the benefics because it decreases their natural tendency towards beneficence. And that then becomes some of the primary keywords for the nodes throughout the rest of the medieval astrological tradition in the West.
Mm-hmm.
So
and the same thing happened. Go ahead, sorry.
So it's just interesting, though, that the nodes aren't mentioned very frequently in the early Hellenistic tradition. And so it sort of makes sense that in parallel in the early Indian tradition, the nodes similarly, as you're saying, are not mentioned very frequently in those three early texts from like the 2nd century CE through the 6th century CE.
But they're mentioned a lot in texts that have to do with the what's called Graha Shanti, which are planetary rites or appeasement ceremonies. And then once the temples started being built in, let's say, 4th century, 5th century, all of the visual images of the nodes started to be produced on the lintels in the temples.
Is it the nodes for sure, though, that are being associated with Rahu and Ketu at that point, or is it Rahu and Ketu as separate deities that are being propitiated that don't necessarily have anything to do with the nodes yet?
They're separate. Rahu does. So Rahu is considered to be the eclipse former, but Ketu is just considered to be a comet or smoke. Ketu has nothing to do with it. It's really Rahu. So you get this whole idea of the Rahu forming the eclipse. Later on, people will then add Ketu to that tradition, and they'll say, oh, it's Rahu and Ketu swallowing up the sun and the moon. But initially, it's only Rahu, and he's the demon whose head gets decapitated, and he then has two bodies. But when you're dealing with Ketu in the early tradition of Indian astrology, Ketu is not in horoscopic astrology, neither is Rahu, but they do get written about, and then they have first Rahu becomes anthropomorphic, and he is seated with the 7 other planets in lintels, in temples, in sculptures. And then towards the end of the 6th century, Ketu starts to get added to it. But Varamahira, who wrote Brihajataka, which is considered to be one of the classics in Indian astrology and in natal astrology, also wrote what's called Brihat Samhita, which is the compendium. Samhita is a compendium. And in that, he talks a lot. In 9 chapters, he talks about the transits of these planets and what they're doing. And in the chapter on Rahu, he talks a lot about eclipses and what eclipses do when they're in each nakshatra, when they're in the signs, how it works for the different areas of India. And at the same time, because he was also a mathematician and astronomer, and a religious person, and this was always the conflict, he talks in this chapter about, the fact that people say that Rahu caused eclipses, but we all know that's not really true. And he sets forth the mathematics of eclipses. But then he also says, but we have to propitiate Rahu. We have to still honor him and propitiate him so he doesn't, damage us. So that is very much part of the tradition. And then in the chapter on Ketu, it's all about comets, because Ketu is a comet. So it's all about the fact that there are hundreds of comets. Some people say thousands of comets. And comets can refer really to meteors, to anything in the sky that is not a planet. So that's kind of like the whole idea of the formlessness. So the Ketu and Rahu were very much part of the tradition and were, drawn and the images were set forth. And Rahu, if you look at images you have in Yavana Jataka, for instance, there's in the very beginning, Pingree put in a picture on the first page of a lintel in a temple, and it's the 8 grahas. And if you look at that, in fact, that is in Worcester, in Massachusetts, in the Art Museum. And it has the 7 planets plus Rahu. And what you'll notice there is that Rahu has this huge head. So all the planets are kind of looking the same. And then at the very end, Rahu is pictured with this humongous head. And that's kind of how he always became portrayed. He had this huge head. And then later on, when they added Ketu, they kind of added this, the bottom of Ketu was like serpentine. That was the imagery of the eclipse, that it was serpentine. It was like how it looked. But you didn't get the astrology of the eclipses, and of the nodes. In fact, what you're saying in terms of how Rhetorius described them, that's very much how they were described in texts that started to appear, I would think 7th, 8th century, when you had Parashara. Parashara's text was the first one that really had the nodes mentioned in it as planets in houses and planets with, signs, and also with the dashas, because the early dashas didn't have Rahu in it or Ketu. That wasn't Vimshotri. Vimshotri is only one dasha system. That didn't appear until you could bring the nodes into your astrology. You couldn't have Vimshotri dasha, because Vimshotri dasha is based on 9 planetary periods. And before that, you had dasha periods, like you have, the planetary lords and, in Hellenistic astrology. But you didn't have Rahu and Ketu in it. You had the 5 planets. And then you had an ascendant dasha. Also, you had 8 dashas.
So Parashara is the point where the nodes get firmly integrated into the Indian tradition, and they, at that point, sort of get elevated almost to the level of planets, or as grahas, where you have the 7 traditional visible planetary bodies, and then you have Rahu, the north node, and Ketu, the south node.
Right. And the thing is with Parashara, and I know this, Parashara is always such a controversial topic
Yeah, what's the
because
dating on Prasha? Yeah,
yeah,
that's
that's the controversy.
a can of worms. Okay.
Well, the controversy really is that um,
When did Pingree date the Parashara?
Pingree,
Let's just say.
well, in his book Jyotish, Pingree dated it till about he had the first and second were saying they were in two parts. One he said was probably between 600 and 750, and then
Mhm.
he thought the other section was by about 800. The reason it's controversial is if you look at Pingree's text, you will see that he describes the chapters. He tells you all the chapters of the manuscript that he has of Parashara. But if you look at the modern day texts of Parashara, there are like 20 more chapters in it.
Mhm.
So
Okay.
over the years, the chapters have been added to. So we don't always know which ones, kind of came in what era.
Mhm.
And a lot of people talk about Parashara as one of their teachers, so he would have been prior to the 6th century. So it might not even be the same person. Again, it could be the lineage. So you see the name repeated. So it's not necessarily that the person who produced these texts in the 7th century was the same Parashara that the Varamahira and other Indian astrologers mentioned as
Mhm.
having, produced material. So a lot of it is orally transmitted. So the point is that there is this text, about 7th, 8th century, 600 to 750. And the nodes
And,
are mentioned in there.
and
And from Shotari Dasha also, which
part of the
has,
issue with Parashara is that it's presented like some of the Hellenistic texts where they're presented as like revealed wisdom to like a king or a sage or something like that from the gods, and Parashara is kind of presented in that way as well, isn't it?
that he's present as a teacher. Yeah. But they don't know exactly if, because they're talking about Parashara as a teacher, but the text doesn't appear till much later. So does it mean that all this knowledge that's in the text was actually revealed but never written down? We don't really know. It doesn't seem likely. It doesn't seem likely because all of the astrologers prior, to the 7th century were not using Rahu Ketu in their horoscopic texts.
Right.
So it doesn't seem likely that you had Rahu Ketu mentioned prior to that. So that's why I think that the dating of at least the text that has the Rahu Ketu in it was probably, as Pingree says, somewhere between 600 and 750
Yeah.
CE.
I guess I was just mentioning that because sometimes people take the figure of Parashara literally and say this is a sage that lived like 10,000 BCE or something
Exactly.
like that, instead of somebody like Pingree is looking at this as this is a
A
text
real
that was
person.
written, a real person that wrote this text sometime around the 8th century. So, okay, so Parashara is when the nodes get fully integrated in Indian astrology. There's delineations. It's also in the Vimshuddhari Dasha system, which is, I think the nodes are actually given Time Lord or Dasha periods that last for how long is a general period of like Rahu or Ketu?
Well, the Rahu period lasts 18 years. And of course, that's interesting because you get the Saros cycle of eclipses that are 18 years. And you get the nodes going through the zodiac in about 18.6 years. So that's kind of an interesting number. And then the Ketu Dasha is 7 years. That one's more quick, because that's how Ketu started to become defined in that way. In later texts, the other interesting thing, for those who really are following all this Indian astrology dating, another important text is called Saravali, and that was supposedly about 800 CE. Some people think it's a little earlier, 8th century. There's no mention of Rahu Ketu in there either. So that becomes funny. But then later on, as I was saying to you, when the text that I learned from Phaladeepika, that was probably around 13th, 14th century. And then you get the Persian Arabic influence there a
Okay,
lot,
let's pause
I
on that
think.
one just because I
Yeah,
want to do a whole separate digression about the Persian influence and the dragon thing.
right.
Where in Parashara, are you comfortable talking about any things that we know from Parashara, at least as far as we know with the text that we have, about how it talks about the nodes or what significations it gives or anything along those lines in terms of how it's conceptualizing them or what meanings it's applying to them?
Yeah, well, I mean, the nodes are always, last. I mean, and they're not. So before Parashara, I mean, the nodes are all, the planets have different meanings. There are 7 planets. They rule the 7 senses. They rule, not 7 senses, sorry. They rule, the 5 planets rule the 5 senses. And then you get different people in the cabinet, like the king, the queen, the prince. You get the 7 planets. And then when you add the Rahu Ketu, they usually come at the end, and they're always talked about in terms of darkness. And the idea of Ketu as the comet, the formlessness, is sort of, in a similar way. They're very malefic, Rahu and Ketu. Most of the time, they're not considered to do any good, except if they are affiliated with good planets or good house rulerships. Then they can form actually very positive yogas. But the idea that they are for the first time looked at in terms of the dashas is a very important thing. Now, when you're talking about Time Lords, for instance, you don't have do you have the nodes in that whole system, or it's not included?
Do the nodes play a role in the Time Lord systems? They might be mentioned like offhand, possibly as what, in terms of what happens if a node gets hit in like primary directions or something like that. But for the most part, no, I don't think the nodes are used in any core role in any of the Time Lord systems that I know of until you get to the medieval period after the nodes get integrated through the Persian tradition. I keep thinking that the Persian tradition is the source of where the nodes become really important. And we'll get into that maybe in a second once we finish talking a little bit more about Parashara.
Yeah, and Parashara is a text, I mean, it's funny, I kind of keep away from it a lot because of all the confusion that comes with it. But the important thing with Parashara is the fact that it does occur, it does formulate the dashas. The nodes are considered to be dark. They're not necessarily considered to be, like I said, benefic forces. They rule things like underground and all the nasty things, that you have.
That seems like a common theme in Indian astrology, is that the nodes are treated as difficult and somewhat chaotic or unstable type factors to some extent. Would you say that's true in a general sense?
Yes, for sure. And they're always considered to be at the very, very end, when you're talking about them. So in Parashara, for instance, you talk about the planets. You do it according to, like the days of the week, Sun, Moon, Mars, Mercury, Jupiter, Venus, Saturn. Then you get Rahu, Ketu at the end because they were added on. And then when you talk about the malefics, Parashara says the Sun, Saturn, Mars, the waning moon, they're all malefics. And then Rahu, Ketu, they also become malefics. So
okay, so Rahu and Ketu are grouped together with the malefics in Parashara?
Yeah, always, yeah.
So that's important. I mean, that's important to know in terms of how they're conceptualizing the nodes and their function in a chart.
Yeah, and they rule outcasts, and foreign, like in modern day, when you're looking at a chart in modern day horoscopy, they take it a lot from the whole idea of Rahu Ketu ruling outcasts. So they say that Rahu and Ketu can rule foreigners. It can rule bohemian, quote bohemians, people that rebel, anybody who is different. So that's kind of like what Rahu Ketu was, conceptualized as. And again, that has to do with that myth because Rahu Ketu are not planets. They're not things. They don't have mass. They don't have shape. They're points. They're where the path of the moon and meets the ecliptic. So you can't hold on to them. They're considered to be shadows because they are appearing in a way that you can't put your finger on. So that's a lot of the way that they do get interpreted in these texts. because they're not real. You know what I mean? They don't have the kind of material qualifications or qualities, that the planets do or stars do. So
Yeah. Maybe we
they're
should
different in that
backtrack a little
way.
bit, which you touched on a little, but just describing the nodes and the astronomy a little bit. So the nodes are the point on the ecliptic where the path of the moon crosses the path of the sun.
Yeah.
And that's basically it. And the north node is when the moon passes the path of the sun and begins moving upwards or north, I guess you could say. Whereas the south node is when the moon passes the path of the sun, which is the ecliptic or the zodiac, and begins moving downwards or south, basically, right? Is that correct?
Yeah, exactly.
So as a result of that, the nodes, because they represent the intersection or the crossing over point between the path of the sun and the path of the moon, when you get a new moon in the zodiac or a full moon, which occurs close to the nodes, you always know that an eclipse is going to take place close to that point, because when the lunations occur close to the nodes, that's when the moon will obscure the sun and basically move across the face of it, or at least it has the potential to.
Right. Yeah. So when you look at a chart, when you see that those nodes are very close to the sun and the moon, there's an eclipse rather than just a normal lunation. And they occur every 6 months, and that's also why the whole idea of Rahu became this feared, this demon that they considered Rahu to be a demon, because they knew that when eclipses came, things went dark. Suddenly, and of course the myth surrounding eclipses, that eclipses meant the death of a king or announced the birth of a king. They were always used to have some major event happen along with it. And, in a way, that's how we use it in modern times, if we're using it astrologically. But
right. And so let's see, eclipses, and sometimes in the Greek text, the Hellenistic astrologers actually refer to the nodes as the eclipsing places, as a result of that. And this may be, some of the interesting parallels between the Hellenistic tradition, or at least some pieces of the Hellenistic tradition and the Indian tradition, where the nodes are treated more negatively, is Valens. There's this one famous chapter in Valens where he talks about inceptional astrology, and he talks about not putting the moon close to the nodes, or the moon making a hard aspect to the nodes, especially a close one by degree, like a conjunction, square, or opposition. And he goes on this very long and uncharacteristically pessimistic rant about the nodes, evidently based on his personal experience, where he says, and this is in the 2nd century, he says, "Beware of starting anything. Do not sail, do not marry, do not have meetings, do not begin anything, do not plant, do not introduce. In short, do not do anything. What has been started will be judged insecure or prone to come to a bad end, and it will be something regrettable, incomplete, subject to penalties, grievous, and not lasting. If someone seems to have begun the development of some business in these days, the business will go bankrupt, will be troublesome, subject to penalties, easily ruined, and a stumbling block. Not even benefics which happen to be in these places do anything entirely good. Therefore, even without consulting a natal chart, if anyone guards against the current transits of the moon through the ascending node, he will not make a mistake." So that's one of the things, is like there's, like I said, these two traditions in the Hellenistic tradition, and one of them is a very pessimistic take on the nodes, especially when associated with the luminaries, I think because those are the eclipsing places where the lights get sort of extinguished, so to speak, and they treat them as very unstable. And that tradition almost reminds me more of what you end up seeing eventually in the Vedic tradition, which also seems to treat them as more negative or problematic in some way.
Yeah, I think what you're also reading from has to do with the timing of the fact that the nodes were in fact used for in terms of omens and in terms of looking at eclipses as negative, negative forces, because that's really when they saw the nodes, kind of come to fruition when you had the eclipses. And way before, I mean, in the 2nd century, there were texts that had that had the nodes mentioned. So the whole idea of electional astrology or just general astrology that is not horoscopic, those are the two kind of threads that are very distinct also in the Indian tradition, that they were used in the same way you're reading Valens. And there are a lot of texts that are being translated now. Garga Samhita is being translated. This is a text from the 2nd century that Bill Mock and a few people are putting together. But these are texts that are dealing with omens and are dealing with taking trips and planning events. And that was also one of the reasons why, they had to, honor the deities and appease the deities as well, so that they could, do things and have the blessings, of the planets. And so that was always the same. It seems like it's the same tradition in Hellenistic, that it took a while for it to get into the horoscope, as well. Because, you always knew that the nodes were there. In terms of Ketu being the comet, or meteors or something formless, I'm not sure how that works in terms of the Hellenistic tradition. But that was, the definite tradition in India, because that's what it was all about.
All right. So is there anything else we need to mention about the nodes, or getting into the meaning of the nodes in texts like Parashara that we can say more securely? Where does the tradition of associating them almost with being like Saturn-like or Mars-like come from?
I don't know if it's in Parashara per se, but I do know in the text that I learned from, as I showed you, it's very clearly written that Saturn, that Rahu acts like Saturn, and Ketu acts like Mars. And I'm assuming it's somewhere in Parashara. Parashara is so big, that I don't know every little thing that's in there. I haven't read every little thing of Parashara. I apologize. But in the text of Phaladeepika, which specifically says in there that he learned from Brihat Parashara Hora Shastra, so it's that tradition. They say specifically that that Rahu acts like Saturn, because also it's slow and it's dark, and Saturn was given to delays and obstruction. So Rahu is very much like Saturn. And in the Vimshottari Dasha system, Saturn is 19 years and Rahu is 18 years. And then Ketu is like Mars, and they are both in the Vimshottari Dasha system 7 years. So they do have that similarity. And also because originally it was like a comet, it was like psh, Mars, like things just exploding, if you think of the whole imagery of Mars as this, explosion oriented planet. So it is very clear that that's one of the affiliations that you get, and later on when you are doing, interpretation, I find it helps a lot to look at Ketu like Mars and Saturn like and Rahu like Saturn. That's a whole other story. But yeah, I mean it's quite clear that that's one of the things that they affiliated it with, and then others, other things, of course. Like I said, the Saturn, Rahu and Ketu had to do with being an outcast. They were like the outcasts of the planetary pantheon. They were on the very end of the scale, so to speak.
And you sent me some delineations from Phaladeepika. Which is dated somewhere from the 13th to the 16th century. Is it okay if I share some of these on the screen?
Oh, yeah.
Okay.
For sure.
So this is a little bit later, but this gives you an idea of where, and you said this is maybe an outgrowth or sort of later development of where the Parashara tradition started going.
Yeah, he says specifically that he was one of the texts, that he learned from.
Okay, so this is from chapter 8. It says, Sloka 25, if at birth Rahu occupies the Lagna, which is the rising sign, the person concerned will have a short life, possess wealth and strength, and will suffer frog diseases in the higher limbs of his body. So that's a little mixed.
Weird.
Short life, so it's like something that's depriving life, but then it says possesses wealth and strength, but then he'll be diseased in his body, which is like a first house type signification. Then it goes on, it says the person who has at his birth Rahu in his second house will be dubious or insincere in his speech. Since speech is one of the significations associated with the second house in Indian astrology, will suffer from disease in the mouth or face, will be tender-hearted, will get wealth through his sovereign, and will be wrathful and happy. All right, so Rahu Go ahead.
No, I'm saying that they all get very mixed up. A lot of these, when you read all these texts, they'll throw in
like positive and negative.
Yeah, some of the houses and things like that. But here they start the tradition of Rahu in the third house being strong. And Rahu in the sixth house is supposed to be strong. 3rd, 6th, 10, and 11 by tradition are supposed to be the places where Rahu is strong. And they don't delineate them in terms of sign. They delineate them in terms of the houses, which is another interesting thing.
So you said this was tied in with the tradition of which houses the benefics and malefics do well in?
Yeah.
What is that again?
3rd, 6th, 10th, and 11th. Are considered to be the houses of what's called upachaya houses or growth houses. But they are the houses, and some people take them, the 3rd and 6th as being very, bad. The 6th house is also what's called a Dushtana house, so it has a dual meaning. The 10th house is also what's called a Kendra house, an angular house. So it also has a strong another meaning. But the 3rd, 6th, 10th, and 11th are usually where you want malefic planets to be. So if they have in these, and what it does also is if you see it in the 3rd house, it will give you a something strong. If you see it in the 6th house, it's going to give you something strong, but it's also going to give you something that you have to fight for, because the 6th is the house of illness. So because it's the house of illness, in order to overcome something, you have to have something bad to overcome. So if you have the nodes or a malefic, Mars, Saturn, or the sun even is considered a malefic, in a house like the 6th house, you are going to be able to overcome things, but you have to have something to overcome to begin with. So it gets mixed, but there's a logic to it. There's a strange logic to it. But even in this tradition, Rahu Ketu can't always fill the same shoes, so to speak, as the planets, because the planets have relationships like friendships and enemies. Rahu Ketu doesn't fit into that category. So, and a lot of the dasha systems are not all based on having the nodes in them. I mean, Vimshotri is only one system. It's not the be-all and end-all. A lot of people don't, use other systems too. So you won't get Rahu Ketu in a lot of those systems. In some, you get Rahu and not Ketu, because Ketu is considered to be, it's like smoke, but later on, when you talk about Rahu Ketu being the head and the tail, or in India, just the top and the bottom, Rahu is this head or the top of the body, but Ketu is the bottom. So because Ketu has no eyes and doesn't see and doesn't think, logically, they take it out of the running when it comes to aspects and transits. Ketu is not mentioned in transits, but Rahu is. So they are still, even though they're using Ketu, they're still looking at it as, kind of not having equality with the rest of the planets. So it's an interesting kind of concept that Ketu is really, something that you can't define, or, that sort of scares you, much more than Rahu in a lot of ways. And I think that's also where it all came from about, your past life is there. And so you have to, work out whatever Ketu didn't allow you to work out, that kind of thing that happened with the South Node in modern day, delineations. So it is interesting, because the transits are used. I mean, people make a mistake also to think that only dashas are used in predictive work, but the transits are very important. in Indian work. Very important.
So, but the general thing, though, was that there's certain houses that the malefics were said to do better in general, and there's certain houses that the benefics were thought to do better in. And generally speaking, the nodes started being assigned because they were malefics to also doing better in certain houses.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So let's go back to the delineation here. Rahu in the third house makes the person born proud, hostile to his brothers, strong-willed, long-lived, and wealthy. So that's interesting. Hostile to his brothers as a third house signification. If Rahu should occupy the fourth house, the person born will be a fool, will cause sorrow, will be short-lived, and will be rarely happy. So again, we're seeing kind of a continuation where it is treating it more malefically, at least more consistently than not. So let's see. Sloka 26. If at a person's birth Rahu should be posited in the fifth house, he will have nasal touch in his speech, will be childless, he will be hard-hearted and suffer from stomachache. So fifth house is the house of one of the houses of children and being childless if you have Rahu there. So that's obviously more of a negative delineation. If Rahu's in the sixth house, the person will be troubled by his enemies or oppressed by evil planets. He will suffer from an ulcer in his anus. He will be wealthy and long-lived. So it's giving negative delineations for both of the traditional topic of enemies in the sixth house, as well as some sort of negative delineation for health matters as well, but then something positive coming from wealth and longevity.
Right. So you start out with these horrible things, but you have the willpower to kind of conquer them. I mean, these are all, like any classically written text, they're all very, kind of short. They really encompass a lot of different things. And there's also different translations as well. I took this one translation. It's very possible if I read through it, I would translate it a lot differently. But,
sure. But I'm just trying to get a sense of it, though, really quickly.
You find that Rahu Ketu, even if you go into India and you mention Rahu Ketu, people get, people who years ago would just get very nervous, if you talk about them. And even the temples, dedicated to Rahu Ketu, it's not like just freely you go in there and you worship. So they are really still considered to be, these demonic forces that, and especially because Rahu was the demon in the early tradition of the eclipses, it doesn't go away. That whole idea of, don't talk about Rahu Ketu,
Yeah, and from what I understand, like the Rahu and Ketu periods are not traditionally considered to be like great dasha periods to go into necessarily, or very fun ones.
Well, again, everything then starts to get translated differently, as the years go by and you go into modern times. So, Rahu is 18 years. So you're not going to say, the whole 18 years is bad. And if you have, let's say, Rahu in your 3rd, 6th, 10th, or 11th, or let's say Rahu is with a benefic, the dasha period could be good because you're taking on the qualities, of the benefics, or you're taking on the quality of the lordship of a good house. And because Rahu is like Saturn, sometimes it's just slow and drawn out. But, Rahu is extraordinarily extreme. That's the thing with the nodes, is that they became noted for the extremities. So you can go from high to low. You can be very compulsive. That Rahu can be very compulsive. Again, the symbolism of the head, that doesn't digest. It keeps eating and taking in things, but it doesn't have a digestive system. So with Rahu, you have to know when your boundaries are. So in modern kind of astrology or, counseling, you try to tell people to try to set those boundaries, because otherwise you can get swept away, in terms of the, addictive quality. Ketu is 7 years, like Mars. It's quick. You can go from high to low or low to high. I've seen people in Ketu Dasha have things just completely wiped out. And I've seen people go from low to high, I lecture on that all the time with amazing examples, and I think that that's something that, as you go on through life and are in modern times and you have more choices. It's not like living in a little village with your astrologer who sets your life path for you. So it's a very different, you use Hellenistic astrology. So yourself that when you're dealing with modern times, you have to take these translations and, sort of extend it or modernize them,
Yeah, I
to
mean,
some
the
extent.
ancient texts usually frame things in terms of extreme, either worst or best case scenario, and you're supposed to understand that there's many different mitigating conditions that you can take into account to modify or produce the actual delineation, but it's trying to convey some sort of underlying principle to you.
Right.
So here's a little, for those unfamiliar with it, from Solar Fire, just a chart of today, approximately when we started. And this is like one of the traditional South Indian square charts. And over on the right, it has the Vimshuddhari dashas and bhuktis. And it just shows you some of the periods that we're talking about, where there's like a Mars general period that lasts for 7 years. And then there's a Rahu period that lasts for 8 years, and a Ketu period that lasts for 7 years, as you were saying. Okay. So back to the delineation.
But if you go to Parashara or Phaladeepika, the text I use, I mean, they will give you, really, especially Phaladeepika tells you about the dashas, what to expect in Rahu dasha, what to expect in, Ketu dasha, what to expect in Moon dasha, and then what to expect in all the sub-periods, of the dashas. So they're pretty clear, but then you have to take that as a general rule, and you always have to look at what everything is doing in the natal chart, in order to really come to a conclusion about what the general dasha is, or general transit. So that's kind of the thing, is that because Rahu and Ketu are, I think they're like intensifiers, everything they come in contact with gets just intensified. Rahu with Jupiter can give somebody who has enormous wealth, an enormous greed at the same time, so it kind of works like that, in a lot of respect.
So back to Phaladeepika. So I just want to briefly mention some of the other delineations to just give people an idea of where the Indian traditions start going with this. So it says, when Rahu's in the 7th house, the person will lose his wealth through intrigues with women. So basically, like problems with relationships. If Rahu occupies the 10th house, the person will be short-lived, will do impure acts and other issues. If Rahu happens to be in the 9th house, the person will be unfavorable in speech. He will be head of his clan, the headmaster of a village, or a mayor of a city, and will commit unrighteous deeds. Is that notion of like unrighteousness as a result of like religious associations with the 9th house?
Yeah, the house of righteousness and dharma.
House of righteousness.
Yeah.
Dharma, okay.
Yeah.
Rahu in the 10th makes the native famous. The man will have a limited number of issues, will engage himself in others' business, will not do any good act, and will be fearless.
And that's Donald Trump has Rahu in the 10th.
Okay, so, that's funny.
Yeah. So you see how that works.
Okay. If Rahu will be in the 11th house, the person born will be prosperous, will not have many children, will be long-lived, and will suffer from ear disease. So this is interesting.
11th house rules ears.
This is one of those positive delineations, and you said the 11th was one of those houses you were talking about that was in an improving, or like an upachaya house.
Upachaya. Mm-hmm. So the thing is that even with the good things that Rahu gives, there's always a catch to it. I mean, it's not going to give you like Jupiter. You know what I mean? It's not going to be all good. There's always going to be a little catch to it. So of course you're going to find, okay, you live a long life, you do this, but you're going to have ear trouble, it's not going to be perfect, So that's very much how they look at these malefics. You have to, you're not getting off scot-free, Well, there's always a price to pay for everything.
So it says you'll be prosperous, but will not have many children. And is the 11th one of the places of children in Indian astrology?
The 5th is the house of children. So if you have Rahu in the 11th, you have Ketu in the 5th. But also because in Indian astrology, the planets aspect the opposite house or the opposite sign. So, and of course in that tradition, if you don't have any children, it's not considered a good thing, because the progeny in your family is very, very important, passing on.
So Rahu and Ketu don't have special aspects like the three of the other planets do, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, but they do not just affect the house that they're in, but also the house they're opposite to.
Yeah, but Rahu is also given, again, there's different traditions. Some people look at Rahu as aspecting 5 and 9 places from it. So it's got like the same special aspect as Jupiter has.
Okay.
And then I have known some people to take Ketu, but I was taught that Ketu cannot aspect because Ketu cannot see. And the word for aspect in Indian, in Sanskrit is drishti, which means to see or to know. That's the whole idea of an aspect, that you're seeing another planet. You're bringing that other energy into your life. I think in any ancient tradition, that's how they saw aspects. So if you have Ketu or the South Node, they can't see because they don't have any, they don't have a head, they don't have eyes. So,
right.
Yeah, that's kind of how it works.
So let's see, going back, Rahu in the 12th house, the person concerned will be intent on committing sinful acts secretly, will spend much, and will suffer from dropsy and the like. So is the 12th treated as like a house of secrecy in Indian astrology?
Yeah, secret enemies, secrecy, yeah, all that stuff, same thing.
So then it goes on and it starts doing delineations of Ketu, the South Node. It says, those born with Ketu in the rising sign will be ungrateful, unhappy, and bearing tales against others. He will be an outcast, fallen from his position, and will have a deformed body, and will be associated with the wicked. Ketu in the second makes the native devoid of learning and riches. So negative delineation for the second house. His speech will be very vile in quality, and he will have a sinister look. He will ever be eating at others' tables. So that's almost like an entirely negative and much more negative delineation of South Node in the second house almost than it was for North Node in the second house, I think, right?
Right. But the second house is, like I said, the second house is also not supposed to be necessarily a great house for the nodes.
For the nodes,
as in the third. And if you go down now to the third house, it says good things, but at the end it says, oh, but he will lose a brother. So it's they're all good, but there's something, bad as well.
So it says Ketu in the third house confers on the native long life, strength, wealth, and fame. The person will live happily, and his wife will eat good food. He will lose a brother.
Yeah.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Got it. Let's see.
And Ketu is like loss a lot of times because Rahu is, sort of like this voracious, greedy head or top of the body. So the Rahu is acquiring things. Whereas Ketu is losing things, because again, the bottom half of the body is where the waste material goes. So it wastes, it loses. And like Mars, it obliterates. So a lot of times these definitions will have loss, fourth house, he will leave his native country, things like that. So if you take that Ketu as having to do with something getting cut off, or loss or separation, a lot of those definitions, will hold through. And, the thing is that it's the same with the dashas that, again, if it's associated, with a good planet or it's in a good house, even the difficult, dasha periods will not be so bad, in it. So you always have to judge the placement of the planets in terms of the other planets that they're associated with. So that becomes very important, in terms of how you acquire meaning or how you acquire your definition, from the others that you're, friendly with or affiliated with in that sense.
Right. All right. So the text says, Ketu in the fourth house, the person concerned will lose lands, vehicles, mother, and happiness. He will leave his native country and dwell in a foreign place and live at the border of another. Ketu in the fifth house at a person's birth will cause loss of children, disease in the stomach, and trouble from goblins. The native will become evil-minded and wicked. Ketu in the sixth house, the person concerned will be very magnanimous and possess the best qualities. He will obtain everlasting fame, firmness, and high authority, destroy his enemies, and realize his wishes. That's again, a very positive delineation.
Yeah, again, that's third, sixth, the sixth house is again, the house of... Is it like that also in Hellenistic, that the malefics in the 6th house, for instance, that's a house of enemies? Does it work well? Do they work well as they do in Indian tradition?
It's kind of mixed. It depends on like the malefics theoretically, sometimes in like Paulus in the 4th century, if they're in a good sign and if they're of the sect in favor, if it's like Saturn in a day chart in the 12th house or Mars in a night chart in the 6th house, and it's otherwise well positioned, then they can be said to give good indications in those placements, I guess. Yeah, just because those are the planetary joys of the malefics.
It works kind of similar.
Okay. Let's see. 6th house, 7th house, the person at birth who has Ketu posited in the 7th will suffer disrespect, seek the company of bad women, will be afflicted by a disease relating to the bowels, and will suffer loss of wife and vital power. So definitely more sense of like loss with Ketu, like you were saying, or letting go of something. If Ketu is in the 8th house, the person born will be short-lived, will suffer the separation of his dear friends, engage in quarrels, will meet with injury from a weapon, and disappointment in all his undertakings. So the 8th, the very first delineation was short-lived because the 8th in Indian astrology has to do with like longevity. Longevity. Okay.
Yeah.
If Ketu occupies the 9th house, he'll follow a sinful course, will do unrighteous things, and will be deprived of his father, will be unlucky, indignant, and will slander the good.
The father in Indian tradition, the 9th house is the father. So that's why it says that.
Okay. That makes sense. In some traditions of Hellenistic astrology, the 9th is the father as well because the sun has its joy there. All right. 10th house, Ketu, the person born will experience obstacles to the performance of good acts, will be impure, and will be engaged in doing vile acts. He will be energetic, bold, and widely renowned.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah.
Because the 10th in Hellenistic astrology, the 10th is the house of praxis, which means action. And something that Schmidt always pointed out that he liked was that action or praxis in Greek is actually a pretty close analogy to the word, I think, that gets associated with the 10th house, which is karma, which is like also like action or the result of past action, right?
Right. Well, the word karma, I mean, if you just take the word per se and look it up in a dictionary, it means action. Exactly. Okay. It's movement, it's what you're making of things. So that's exactly what happens when you're dealing with karma. It's what you're making. It's the actions that you took in a previous life that will define the actions that you need to take in this life. So the 10th house is, it's come to mean status, profession, all of that. But it's definitely that what you're doing in the world, the actions that you're taking, for sure.
Okay. So that's why the delineation that it produces here with Ketu in the 10th is the person born will experience obstacles to the performance of good acts.
Yeah.
And will be engaged in doing vile acts, basically, or bad acts. So that's interesting. Ketu in the 11th, the person will hoard money, will have many good qualities, will enjoy himself well, will command all the facilities for getting good materials, and will be successful in obtaining all his requirements.
Yeah, then again, that's also a matter of translation. Here it says hoard money, but actually it can mean that you're very good with money, that you're investing it wisely and you're not being, a spendthrift, let's say.
Okay. And then finally, Ketu in the 12th, the person born will secretly commit sinful acts, spend money on vile things, will destroy wealth, will be of forbidden conduct, and will suffer from eye disease.
Yeah, because it rules the eyes.
Got it. Anything? Okay, I think that's good.
Yeah.
So that gives us some idea of where the Indian tradition started to take things in terms of the interpretation of the nodes. We should talk about, because this ended up affecting both the Indian tradition as well as the Western medieval tradition, where at some point, running parallel to the later Hellenistic tradition or just after the Hellenistic tradition, there was a several century tradition of astrology in Persia from like the 3rd century through the 6th or 7th century. And it seems like it was from that tradition that they started associating the nodes with a dragon. And they associated the north node with the head of the dragon and the south node with the tail of this dragon. And there's actually a really interesting story. It's like a mythological story about the cosmological, the creation of the cosmos that involves this dragon. That's kind of like the Thema Mundi. It's like a Thema Mundi type story. And Dimitra George actually translated a version of this story years ago about the dragon having its head in, I think it's a Gemini, and its tail in Sagittarius at the birth of the cosmos. And then it goes about explaining how the rest of the planets got assigned to different signs in the zodiac. Anyways, this seems to have come out of the Persian tradition, and then we see traces of it show up then within the next few centuries in the Western tradition, where the medieval astrologers writing in Arabic start associating the North Node and calling it the head of the dragon, and the South Node the tail of the dragon, and driving some significations from that. And then that tradition also kind of influences the Indian tradition a little bit, right?
Yeah, I think that's interesting what you're talking about, because in Parashara, for instance, one of the things in Parashara is that they did add Rahu Ketu to the signs in which they are exalted. So Rahu,
which signs?
Taurus. In Parashara, it's in Taurus. The North Node is exalted in Taurus, and the South Node is exalted in Sagittarius. Scorpio. But actually, then there are other traditions which happened later on, and maybe that's what's being, mixed in with the Persian, where Rahu is exalted in Gemini and Ketu is exalted in Sagittarius. That was what I learned. So, and I always think that as well, that, Rahu, because it's like Saturn, maybe then just becomes friends with the same planets that Saturn is friends with. So here we have in the Indian tradition, Venus, Mercury, Saturn are friends, and Sun, Moon, Mars, Jupiter are friends. So then you get the Rahu exalted in either Taurus or Gemini, which are both Venus and Mercury ruled, whereas Ketu is going to be in Scorpio or Sagittarius, which is Mars or Jupiter ruled. But that's interesting, that what you just said about the Gemini and Sagittarius, because that makes sense in terms of saying that the nodes are exalted there in the Indian tradition.
Also. Yeah, I forgot about that. It's like that tradition, or the Parashara tradition, has the nodes exalted in Taurus and Scorpio. And then this like medieval tradition coming from the Persians has them in Gemini and Sagittarius, and that seems to have been the one that influenced the Western tradition, where some astrologers start mentioning the nodes being exalted in those signs. I wonder if that comes... I didn't
learn any exaltations myself, and I don't believe in Phaladeepika. When I learned in India, they were, my teacher, I had two teachers. One was academic, but the one I learned from in the bazaar, he just used Phaladeepika, and I never learned anything about exaltations for the nodes. It was just later on when I started reading more and, comparing what I learned to other texts, But yes, I think the Gemini and Sagittarius is quite interesting, because it makes perfect sense in terms of what you said.
Ben and I actually came up with a rationale for that was based on Abu Mashar explains an astronomical rationale for that, and putting it into a specific degree in Gemini that they must have used. But I wonder if in the Indian tradition, for example, if the nodes got associated with Taurus and Scorpio because of the exaltations of the moon, which has its exaltation in Taurus, and then the opposite to that would be Scorpio. So I wonder if that's connected at all about why they would have placed it there rather than anywhere else.
That makes sense. Yeah, I don't know. I haven't really thought about why it would be, but that does make sense that the moon, because the moon's exaltation is Taurus.
Sure. So I want to read this little myth that Dimitra translated years ago from a text in the CCAG. This is something that was probably originally written as in Persian, and then was translated into Arabic, and then the Arabic version was translated into Greek several centuries later. So you can find it in the CCAG, and it's titled The Foundation of the Astrological Art, the Opinion According to the Chaldeans. So it says, the statements of a wise man concerning the diverse and manifold sphere according to the opinion of the experienced and most wise Chaldeans. He said that all-wise God fashioned a huge dragon in regards to its length and width and depth, and it had a dark-colored head called the Ascending One, and on the eastern horizon, and its tail, called the descending one, on the western horizon. Next, he began to make the 12 signs of the zodiac, each differing from the other in nature and position. I mean, the ram, the bull, the twins, the crab, the lion, virgin, scales, scorpion, archer, goat, the water pourer, and the fish. And he commanded this same dragon to support 6 zodiacal signs upon its back. These so-called upright and slow-moving signs, the signs of long ascension, I mean the ones from the 30th degree of the twins to the 30th degree of the archer in the invisible hemisphere from the 1st degree of the horizon, that is to say from the east to the west, and the remaining 6 zodiacal signs from the 30th degree of the archer to the 30th degree of the twins, called the oblique and fast rising signs, rising in the visible hemisphere. Next, he made the 7 other visible planets or visible stars, Saturn, Jupiter, Mars, the Sun, Venus, Mercury, and the Moon. Then in the following manner, he placed the Moon in Cancer, the Sun in Leo, Mercury in Virgo, Venus in Libra, Mars in Scorpio, Jupiter in Sagittarius, and Saturn in Capricorn. So that's basically the creation of the Thema Mundi. And then what's funny is it actually has this rationale. It goes on to explain how the planets got assigned to the second sign of the zodiac. And it says, thus he moved the brilliant sun against the background of all the stars towards Virgo, and then towards each of the zodiacal signs in order from the west to the east. And Hermes, Mercury, seeing the sun approaching him in Virgo, unable to bear the burning intensity of his rays, fled running full speed and came to the twins. So Mercury basically packs up his bags and moves from Virgo to the furthest sign away from the sun, which is Gemini. And then it says Mercury dwelt there for a time near the moon. Similarly, Aphrodite, Venus, seeing the sun coming towards Libra and not being able to withstand its rays, also went towards Taurus next to Mercury. She being turned away from him, and then it says Mars being against the ram next to Venus is turned away from her, and it just explains the rest of the planets. Venus, Jupiter, and then Saturn eventually all move to their next sign, which explains the second sign of the zodiac that each of them rule. It says Saturn moving to Aquarius, not having another place, was overtaken under the beams of the sun and was burnt up and dried out, and through this became black or dark. And for this reason, he distributed two houses to each of the appointed 5 stars, and to the sun and moon 1 house each. Anyway, so it goes on and it has this whole other thing about the planets and about the creation of the exaltations as imposed on the Thema Mundi and the birth chart of the cosmos. And in particular, though, what was important is just that it said the dragon, which it's using in this creation myth, had its head in the sign of Gemini, which would be the 12th house in the Thema Mundi that has Cancer rising, and it had its tail in Sagittarius, which would be the 6th house in the Thema Mundi.
And what year is that from? What she translated?
It's like the text, the Greek text itself was from the 14th century, but it's probably copying over a text that was written around the 9th century or probably earlier from the Persian tradition, like probably 6th century. So there's a great academic article on this, which is actually available on academia.edu for free. It's also published in a book, but it is titled, let me share it here on the screen really quickly. It's titled From Lunar Nodes to Eclipse Dragons, the Fundamentals of the Chaldean Art and the Reception of Arabo-Persian Astrology in Byzantium by Adrian Pertia. So you can find that on academia.edu. It gives a great overview of the early history of the nodes in the Western Greek tradition and how they weren't associated with the head or tail of the dragon, but then later through this Persian tradition and probably this Persian mythology, this notion of the dragon being associated with the nodes came to be integrated into it, and how they created a new sort of Thema Mundi rationale to rationalize it or explain it.
Well, I think that what happened also, if you look at Abu Mashar and you look at Parashara and you look at that kind of turning point around 7th, 8th century, all those years, it does seem to have a turning point in how the nodes were done. And what I sent
Right.
you along with the Phaladeepika was something from Bonnati, which you've probably already seen, that by that time, Bonnati is quoting Abu Mashar. I
Mhm.
sent it to you along with the Phaladeepika.
Yeah, let me
To
open the Bonnati thing right now if you want.
Yeah, because he's also talking about from Abu Mashar. He's sort of quoting him, but that whole period, the nodes started to get used, a lot, and so I think that's why I always thought that when the Muslim rule came into India in the second millennium, that was always what I thought. Well, there's a lot of Persian influence there. And of course, then Tajika came about, which we know. And that also is a Persian influence, even though a lot of the Tajika texts don't really talk about the nodes that much. But that doesn't mean they weren't in a lot of the Persian literature. And it doesn't mean that the Indians weren't familiarized with it.
Mhm.
Because, especially if you read Al-Biruni, I mean, Al-Biruni came to India and I mean, and his whole book is, Al-Biruni's India. So he, talks a lot about Varamahira and talks a lot about the astrology. I mean, the book is not only about astrology, of course. There's a section on it, but he talks about everything that he learned by being in India, and then, going back, to the Persian tradition. So I think that I always thought myself, and also because Phaladeepika it's a very important text, and it's one that a lot of people use, even though it was written probably 13th, 14th century. So it's not classical. It is taking the classical work of Parashara because the author Mantrasvara says so, but it's also taking into account a lot of other things that came from this Persian Arabic tradition because of the years that it was written. You couldn't not have that tradition influence Indian astrology. And I think that what happens a lot is that sometimes people forget that the astrology is done in India today and passed down is not just classically taken from one text of Parashara or one text of the 6th century. It's something that developed over many years because the beauty of India is that it's an unbroken tradition. It never stopped. So it never got it was never pillaged, and it was never that things had to be retranslated. So a lot of astrologers, by the time, the 18th century, 19th, 20th century, they're using techniques that were written from the Hellenistic tradition, from the Indian tradition, from the Persian tradition. It all gets, mixed in, even though their basis is going to be what came about in the early part of the first millennium. What you have now is you have an amalgam of many different techniques that are part of, if you go to an astrologer in India, he'll, talk about and use in their, delineations. So I
Yeah.
think that, for me, that's always been the interesting thing, when, as the millennium, came to a close and you had the Muslim, kind of occupation of India, how the astrology changed along with it, which is,
Yeah. I think
important.
it seems like a lot of this stuff came out of the Persian tradition around the 6th century, and then that became a common, transition point or transfer point
Mm-hmm.
between the Eastern and the Western traditions was
Mm-hmm.
that Persian tradition. Like you have what is essentially like modern day Iran right now.
Right.
And to the left of that or to the west of that, you have
It's
Baghdad.
Baghdad.
And that's where all of the
Right.
major astrologers that were writing in Arabic in the early medieval Western tradition in the 8th and 9th centuries, like Masha Allah and Saul and Abu Mashar, were all in that area around
Mm-hmm.
Baghdad.
Right.
Then you have Iran or Persia acting as an intermediary. And then over to the right of that, you have, of course, India and the westernmost portions of India where the Islamic rule went right up to border that. And prior to that, the Persian Empire also bordered some of that as well. So there's this exchange that goes on between East and West in the medieval period, and some of this doctrine or some of this, the emphasis of the nodes may have come out of Iran, especially in terms of some of this mythology about dragon.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Go ahead.
in India, at some point they started associating it with maybe not the head of a dragon, but the head and tail of like a serpent or something, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was serpentine. I mean, a lot of times when you're writing, I would write my book a lot differently, but I would talk about the Rahu Ketu being the dragon's head and tail because things got, mixed in. And even in India, people talk about that. But really, there are no dragons in Indian mythology. It's not something they talked about. They didn't exist, the dragons. So they were serpentine. That was the symbology. It was more like the whole idea of the whole serpentine and the way the serpent. He explains that very well in Purtia's article. The shape and when you're talking about the eclipse and how they kind of viewed the shape of it and the shadow. And that's how they kind of got the idea of the dragon and, of course, the fire breathing. But then they also got the idea of the serpent symbols as well. So
yeah, well, isn't there like a cobra or something? Doesn't it actually have the shape, the symbol basically that we use for the nodes? Like I just did a search for like snake, node symbol, and you can kind of see it there. It looks like a south node that's on the head of this snake.
Right. And in some of the photos that you get, like that they have in the temples, and these sculptures, and you have the gathering of the 9 grahas that they really started sculpting more towards the 8th, 9th, 10th century. You start seeing those 9 grahas together, whereas early on you saw 8. You saw the 7 with Rahu. You didn't see Ketu, but then later on you saw it. You could see that that Ketu had like the bottom of Ketu didn't look like the others. It was kind of like serpentine or like a fishtail sort of thing. So you could see the difference in how Ketu was, portrayed in art and how Rahu was portrayed as this big head. If you see the gathering of the, I don't know if I sent it to you, but if you see that, there's a lot of sculptures, available. I mean, they're in museums and, they're all over the internet. You just have to kind of, look for the Navagraha and it'll show you that. Yeah.
Here's another one that looks kind of like the back of a snake. And there's like for those just listening to the audio version, it's like there's 2 circles and then there's like a U that's underneath that connects them in a sense. And that's kind of very similar to what the symbols that we end up using for the north and south node look like.
Yeah.
Is a version of that, or like an inverted version of that.
Yeah.
So let's check out the excerpts from Bonnati that you wanted to mention, because this sort of shows you where things headed in the Western tradition, especially after Abu Mashar and the integration of this tradition from Persia with the nodes, as well as some of the earlier tradition from like Rhetorius on the nodes. So this is, I'm guessing, from like Ben's translation, right? Ben Dykes?
I don't know. Somebody posted this. So if it's Ben's, I'm sorry that I didn't acknowledge it.
Okay.
Somebody happened to post it on a Jyotish group that I'm with, and I thought, oh God, I'm like talking to Chris in a couple of days. I should just, send this to you. I thought, let me send this to you along with Phaladeepika because they're around the same timing, that this is from 13th century.
Got it.
So I thought it was interesting to compare.
13th century Bonnati, sometime around like 1277 or 1300 CE in the West. And it says, and Abu Mashar said, if the north node, the head of the dragon, were in the first house in any solar revolution or any natal chart or any horary chart, it signifies increase and strength and loftiness in that revolution, in that chart. And this according to its conjunction with the planets. For if the north node, the head, were joined with benefics, it signifies the increase of good. If, however, it was joined with the malefic, it signifies the increase of evil, since its nature is to increase. And if the north node were in the second house, it signifies good fortune and substance and its increase, and it signifies the same in a nativity or in a horary question if it were in the second. And the north node in the third, it signifies the native will be an interpreter of dreams and will be of good faith, and there will be useful short journeys in that revolution and acquisitions and profits. And if the North Node's in the fourth, and the fourth house were Aries, Leo, or Sagittarius, or Gemini, or Libra, or Aquarius, it signifies the increase of good and profit from lands and vineyards and from other movable things. If, however, the fourth house were Taurus, Virgo, Capricorn, Cancer, Scorpio, or Pisces, it signifies harm and the decrease of profit. If the North Node were in the fifth house, it signifies the fortune of children and from children, and their increase and good and joy, and freedom from contrary and displeasing things. And if the North Node were in the sixth, it signifies the increase of small animals which are not ridden, and of slaves, and they'll be strong and harmful infirmities. And if the North Node were in the seventh, it signifies the increase of partners and good from women, and an increase of sexual intercourse and strength of enemies. And he just keeps going. Let me see.
So Rahu is for them much more positive in general. The whole idea of going towards something.
Just increasing things.
Yeah.
Is like the primary underlying thing, which can be an increase of good things or an increase of bad things.
Mm-hmm. And if it's with positive, like I said, it's the same thing in Phaladeepika. I mean, these were just the houses, but it also states in there, obviously, if it's with a benefic, it has those benefic qualities. And if it's with a malefic, it has the malefic qualities. It's the same thing.
Yeah.
But this is much more positive in terms of the North Node, as opposed to the South Node. There seems to be a little bit different. The South Node is definitely, it's taking away in this tradition also.
Yeah.
Except the North in 12 is not great.
If the North Node's in the 11th house, Abu Mashar said that there's no virtue of the head or the tail in it for good or evil. And if the North Node were in the 12th house, it signifies the increase of evil and scarcity of good.
Right.
And he goes on, and he says if the South Node, the tail of the dragon, were in the first house, it signifies the detriment of men and the native and the separating away of the good and eradication in dangers and tribulations. And if a son were to remain rich after his father's passing away, he will be reduced to poverty. And if he were to remain a pauper, he will persevere in it. South Node in the second house, it signifies the destruction of all substances and the poverty of a native and his being in need, and his being occupied with evils and his fall from his own station. And this will happen to him from a direction from which he will not have fear, nor will it be suspected. And if the South Node were in the third, it signifies the detriment of brothers, and from brothers and sisters, and because of them and their burden. South Node in the fourth house, it signifies the poverty and need, enmity, and labor, which they will sustain in the investigation of matters without usefulness. Fifth house, destruction of fortune and its expulsion, and a case of horrible things upon children, and that those who will have children will be saddened because of it, and they will be in need, and that men will carry their own clothes.
It doesn't look like the South Node is doing any good, even in the houses that in the Indian tradition, it actually does some good. It seems like it's all pretty horrible.
Well, the one exception, it's any of the good houses, it's the South Node is decreasing good things, so it's impacting negatively, but it looks like when we get to the sixth, it says, in the sixth house, it signifies the laziness and weakness of male and female slaves and small animals and their decrease, and a decrease of infirmities. And if there were infirmities, they will be decreasing and diminishing and decimating or exterminating the bodies of the sick. So there's
same kind of thing.
Yeah, it's like almost maybe taking away some bad things with the sixth, but not entirely. And if the South Node were in the seventh house, it signifies that men will not rejoice with their wives like they are used to rejoicing with them in other revolutions, and there will be quarrels and contentions between them, and this will happen more in the rustics and the common people than with others. Let me skip and see what it says about the 11th to the 12th. And if the South Node were in the 11th house, Abu Mashar says there's no operation for it. And if it were in the 12th, it signifies the detriment of large animals and the destruction of them and of enemies, and few will be incarcerated in that revolution. And if they were incarcerated, the prisons will be emptied of them. The same will happen in nativities or in the revolutions if the tail is in the 12th. Indeed, Abu Mashar said if the tail were in the 12th house, it signifies a scarcity of good fortune and a scarcity of evils. So he said concerning the significations of the planets and of the head and the tail in the 12 houses, if they were in better condition, say better. Indeed, if they were in bad condition, change the content and say the contrary of the good, namely the bad.
Mm-hmm.
All right. So that gives you an idea of where the Western tradition went, especially by the late medieval period, in terms of interpreting the nodes as being about the North Node increasing and the South Node decreasing. And that stays, as far as I know, relatively consistent in the West, that tradition, as well as some additional traditions that still carry on, which continue to treat the eclipsing the nodes as being associated with eclipses and having a sort of negative or ominous or unstable quality occasionally, like in some texts like the Picatrix.
Mm-hmm.
Over in the Indian tradition, I guess it's more of like a continuation primarily of the Parashara tradition and where we saw the Phaladeepika going, right? Is that pretty
Yeah.
standard?
Yeah, it is standard, except that, in modern times, we shouldn't think that everything is as bad as they say, because there are always ways to remediate. I mean, that's the other thing, is that there are remedial measures, and there are also things within the chart itself that you can take, so you can look at the dispositor of a node and see where that goes. You can look at the, aspects. You can look at transits, dashas. Not everything is going to be terrible. You can have wonderful things happen in Rahu Dasha or Ketu Dasha. They're extreme, I mean, we're not talking about the modern. We were really tracing a lot of that. But the malefic quality stays, meaning that, like in any tradition, malefics are not necessarily going to kill you, but they really allow you to kind of move forward with certain challenges in your life. And they're the things that really give you, I think, that kick and that strength. I mean, sometimes we'd rather not have all of that, of course. We'd wish that everything was easy. But the malefics can teach us really good lessons. I mean, the thing is when you're doing, because you do traditional astrology and you have to explain it to a modern audience, and you have to, for me, always the beautiful challenges, were the fact that I would take old delineations and see how they would translate. So you take things like snake bites, and Rahu and Ketu actually, are talked about in some of these texts as causing illness caused by venom. So what does that mean? Well, you take that and you can say, well, that can mean toxicity in terms of, substance abuse, things that you're taking into your body that are going to be toxic. Even, allergies, things, or medications, things like that. So you're always having to sort of, I think that the beauty, what I love about traditional astrology is so much of it really is there, but you just have to kind of translate it into an audience, something for your audience, because we do live in, modern times. What killed you 1,000 years ago isn't going to kill you today necessarily. Of course, we now have a virus that's killing us, so it's kind of interesting when you think about that and the whole idea of, venom and stuff like that. But, I think, going back to our starting point with Rudhyar or Shulman, one of the things that they did do, I think, when I read Shulman's book especially, is, I always tell people, if you believe in reincarnation, that's wonderful. But if you don't, you can still take that book and really look at some nice, imagery for what the nodes represent. And it does represent that idea of increase, and not necessarily taking away or decrease with the South Node, but more as if it's a point of comfort, So you can look at it as saying, okay, that's my past life, but you don't have to. You can look at the South Node as being the place that, you're comfortable with, but that doesn't challenge you, and the North Node is sort of like the place that challenges you, that you want to go towards, because it will reward you, if you allow it to, if you take advantage of it. And that was kind of what he was saying in his book.
So that's where Rudhyar started taking it. Started in 1936, as Rudhyar tried to go back, and he was reading some of the inherited, mainly the later Renaissance tradition of authors like William Lilly and people after that, who continued that direction to some extent that Bonnati took, of treating the North Node as having to do with increase and the South Node with decrease. And Rudhyar tried to go back to first principles, and you can kind of see him philosophizing, and he takes that notion of increase and decrease, and the North Node moving upwards and the South Node moving downwards, and he starts associating it with like directionality and talking about past and future, which you can, when you read this kind of brief treatment in the Astrology of Personality, you can see that he's kind of like riffing on it as something that's not fully formulated yet, but he says almost like speculatively or like perhaps this could be something that could be applied to past, a future life and where you're going versus your past life and whatever karma or whatever things you've brought into this life, because he had a background in theosophy and he was very much influenced by some of the ways that the theosophists were integrating Hindu doctrines of like karma and reincarnation and things like that. So that was Rudhyar in 1936. But then by the time we get to Martin Schulman, and that book's in like what, 1960 or 1970 something?
75, I think it was. Yeah, mid-70s. He did it. I think it was 75. And the other thing that I had told you when we were talking back and forth is the interesting thing is like Margaret Hone. Now, her book, A Textbook of Astrology, a lot of your viewers won't know it, but in the 50s and 60s, even 70s, that was the main text for the Faculty of Astrological Studies in England. That was their text. And when I went through her text, I mean, the North Node and South Node weren't used really. She does say something in there about that it's used in Hindu astrology. But I remember when I started to take the faculty course, I think it was in the late 70s, I started it and then I never finished it. They had a lot of articles that they gave you as supplementary material. So I do believe they had something on the nodes. Of course, they've revamped their whole curriculum and their whole syllabus. But she was really considered to be the main textbook that was used for the faculty. And so the nodes, and then you have also, like you said in the beginning, evolutionary astrology, which, I'm not really that involved with or familiar with, except that they do use the nodes as a starting off point, as they do with draconic astrology. There's also the whole school. Yeah, sorry.
My previous point before we get there about evolutionary. But so the development of this is, Rudhyar is the first one, as far as I can tell, to make the suggestion that they could have to do with past and future lives. Mm-hmm. And it's something that's speculatively presented in 1936 in the Astrology of Personality. And then by like 1975 or so, Martin Schulman publishes this book on the nodes where he goes through and treats them much more explicitly as having to do with past and future lives and, mm-hmm. and provides actual delineations through each of the houses for that. And some astrologers that I've talked to, like Stephen Forrest, have said when they came into astrology, that book had an important influence on them. And it was just something that was taken for granted at that point, that the mm-hmm. nodes pertained to past and future lives. And so that it became, by the last 2 decades of the 20th century, something that was sort of taken for granted by many modern Western astrologers, especially those that were more spiritually oriented or more oriented towards incorporating doctrines of karma and past lives into mm-hmm. their astrology, which became especially prominent in like the evolutionary astrology school with Stephen Forrest and Jeffrey Wolf Green, mm-hmm. but also even in other authors like Jan Spiller, for example, mm-hmm. that is a very important and like key concept in her book that she sort of uses and delineates. Okay, so that's where we're at today in terms of the development of that doctrine. And what were you just saying about evolutionary astrology?
Well, what I was saying was that then suddenly, after you had this sort of nobody was talking about the nodes that much, there were a lot of books on the nodes. Again, some of them out of print. I mean, the Hubers in Switzerland, Louise and Bruno Huber, who really were very, very well known, and they did conferences in Switzerland, as I was saying before we started. They also wrote a book called Moon Node Astrology. And my teacher, when I first started studying astrology, learned from them and talked about very similar things to what Martin Schulman describes the nodes in the houses, although he wasn't talking about it as much as in past lives. But like I said, the delineations are really good. And I think that was a turning point for me because I learned Western astrology before I learned Indian astrology. And to me, when I read Martin Schulman's book, I was like, wow, I mean, the nodes, perfect, clear, because the nodes were something that people were very kind of, very vague on. And Schulman's book was really, I think it's a short book. It's a great book. It's really good in terms of that increase and decrease, where you're going to, push yourself to that north node. That's where you need to go sort of for your evolution. So I'm aware, and I agree that must have been a very huge influence on evolutionary astrology. And yeah, John Spiller and the Hubers had moon's nodes, and then there was a book by Celestial on the nodes, and Pam Crane in the UK wrote a book on draconic astrology, which is a whole other other
that's
field.
a whole other
That's a whole other thing. We don't have to get into that, but that's also.
That's an extension of draconic astrology, is an extension of how the nodes went from not a huge thing in Western astrology or is an extension of how much in modern Western astrology in the final quarter of the 20th century became almost crazy about the nodes. And like the nodes for many people are the first things that you look at in a chart and are the most important things that you look at in some schools of astrologers, some approaches. And draconic astrology takes that further, but the history behind that is a whole separate thing, because I think that's based on a misinterpretation of an ancient text that some astrologers thought it meant something else, that they were creating a whole new zodiac, but they didn't understand. It actually goes back to the very text that we're talking about the dragon that's being created in order to explain the rationale for the exaltation of the nodes in Gemini and Sagittarius. I think that's the text that was misinterpreted, and they thought it meant that you start the zodiac from the degree that the nodes are placed in. So that's created a whole other variant tradition out of maybe a misreading, but that's an episode I hope to do at some point.
My point with that is more just to say that, yes, in the last quarter of the 20th century, the nodes kind of had this revival, or maybe even not a revival, but they started to get noted as a very important factor in the chart. So I think that, and I mean, we always go back to Martin Schulman's book, because his book really was the first one that many of us of a certain era, Stephen and I were kind of the same era. We're a few years apart. He's a little older than me, but other than that, I think that book was very, very important. I mean, I think, I don't know if it's out of print or not. I mean, Martin Schulman is not somebody who's kind of gone to conferences and been around, so he might be living a very nice life, and, we just haven't heard much from him. But his other,
I'm not sure. It looks like 75. It looks like you're right that 75 was the date on the publication of that. And it was titled Karmic Astrology, the Moon's Nodes and Reincarnation. And it was part of a series of like 3 or 4 books.
Right.
Where he did another one on the Lot of Fortune and another one on
retrogrades. The second one was on retrogrades, and the third one was called Joy and the Part of Fortune. I have to tell you, each of those books are really nice, short books, but are very clear, about how to look at retrogrades in the chart and how to look at the part of fortune in the chart. It's kind of an interesting, about, again, that was something that we didn't really look at that much. We knew that it existed, the part of fortune, but
but part of my issue with it, because when I came and just tried to research all of this and studying the history of astrology by the mid to late 2000s, the issue that I ran into when I reconstructed the history of the use of the nodes in different traditions is it means there was at least like 3 or 4 distinct traditions of how to treat the nodes and what they meant, and they were all somewhat different and not entirely related. So there's like one tradition which is I'm not sure if I should do them chronologically or reversed chronologically, but one version is the modern version, which is the north node has to do with your future and the south node has to do with your past life. So that's pretty much it. And it's explicitly tied into the notion of the south node, or the assumption that the south node has to do with the past life. But that as a concept is new and wasn't used prior to the past century, basically. So it doesn't actually have any precedent, and it's not like, it just gets into a whole separate category where it's assumed that that's always been part of the tradition, but in fact it's a recent take on what the nodes mean. So that's one tradition. Then there's the medieval and Renaissance, like Western tradition that partially comes out of parts of late Hellenistic astrology, which is that the north node has to do with increase and the south node has to do with decrease, but it doesn't have any connections with past lives or anything like that. Then there's the Indian tradition, which is the Parashara tradition, which treat the nodes as being very important and sort of crucial in different ways by being integrated into dasha systems and almost treated as given the status of planets, but not quite. And the nodes there are treated as somewhat difficult and sort of destabilizing factors, I guess, is the best summary. Or what's your best, like, one sentence summary of the nodes in Indian astrology in the Parashara tradition?
Well, I always look at them as being intensifiers, that everything gets very intensified when they're with the nodes, and the nodes create a lot of challenges to their general nature. So I always like to take on the whole idea of Saturn. Rahu is like Saturn, but different, in terms of the fact that it's more voracious. Saturn is patient, Saturn has delays in structure. The node has no structure, because it's that head that keeps going over and over. It's compulsive. But like Saturn, it's material. So they consider it material. It wants to gather. It wants to succeed. I don't want to go into, we can go into Donald Trump, but I mean, there's that he was born on an exact eclipse. He's a perfect example of the node in the 10th house, very close to the sun. Then you get the Ketu or the South Node, again, an intensifier, but like Mars, it goes quickly, so it can destroy very quickly if you're not careful. It's like, don't get too close to the fire because it burns you, but it can even work in a very different way than Mars. It can be more destructive. But yet the positive part of Ketu is that you can go quickly and really take those challenges on, but you have to watch it. So again, they're intensifiers, but they're challenges, they're demonic. When I mean demonic in India, they're considered demonic. It's sort of like, like Faust, like you can make a pact with the devil so that you can take it too far and it'll burn you. But if you kind of play along with it and go with their intensity and really meet the challenge of it, you can you can really succeed. But they have their malefic qualities and their dangers, I mean, I'm being a little dramatic, but, on the other hand, they can be wonderful. So I think that's what people were always afraid of, as the years go on, people are embracing Indian astrology more and classical astrology, traditional astrology. But when I started out and told people I had gone to India, they were like, oh, no, please. I don't know. I don't want to know when I'm going to die. And I'm like, well, neither do I, so I'm not really looking at it that way. People were very afraid, of the Indian tradition. And part of it was because of the way the nodes and other malefic forces are conveyed, in some of these texts. And also, if you went to India many years ago, a lot of astrologers were very cut and dry, they didn't mince words. So,
Right.
That's a whole other experience, But
yeah. So
but
in
your position, I think what you said is correct in terms of looking at it in terms of different, cycles or different, partitions, so to speak. Yeah, that works.
So
for
in
me.
the 90s, weren't there some Western astrologers that got into Indian astrology that tried to make analogies between the outer planets and the nodes in order to explain how they're conceptualized in Indian astrology as well?
Right. So and we did this a lot when we were starting to teach Western audiences. We had to be very careful because people were having a hard time kind of adapting to it. I think in this day and age, everybody is so sophisticated with traditional techniques, that they can grab onto it easier. But we always thought that, when I was explaining Rahu and Ketu, I would explain it that Rahu can sometimes be like Uranus or Pluto, and that Ketu can be like Neptune because it's very amorphous. And I know some people say, well, how do you have Mars and Neptune? But actually, they can work in very similar ways in terms of that ability to obliterate and the smoke, the fire. But Uranus and Pluto, again, they're like the independent outsiders. The outer planets in your chart have a lot to do with things that you're doing that are against the norm. Of course, when I was growing up, things that were against the norm are now quite accepted. So you have to reevaluate what's against the norm. But I think the thing is that as that went on, you had to do that because people would say, how can you take away my Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto? Or the same with the sidereal zodiac. How can I be a Taurus in one system and Aries in another? So I think that was how we had to explain Rahu Ketu, because people did not want to, because Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are there. And most there are a lot of Indian astrologers who call themselves neo-Vedic or something. But, when I look at a chart and I look especially at the transits, I'm going to use Neptune, Pluto, and Uranus. I mean, don't you use the transits of Uranus, Neptune, Pluto in your
Yeah,
work?
I do. Yeah, I don't want to go into too much of a digression about that because I know you've got to go soon,
Right.
actually, because you
No,
have to
it's
give
okay.
a lecture. What time is your lecture? Is
My
it at
lecture's at
6?
7. I'm okay.
Okay.
7.
So
7 my time. 4 years. No,
so
5 years.
Uranus and
So-
Pluto, some of the Western Neo-Vedic astrologers associated Uranus and Pluto, you said, with the North Node.
Yeah,
and
I used to say, that's how
Neptune
I
with
did
the
it.
South.
Dennis and I would do that. I mean, and Dennis Harness and I would talk about it. And I remember we always agreed that Ketu was like Neptune because it was like just formless, and that Uranus and Pluto could also be similar to Rahu in that, the intensity of it, first of all, and also the nonconformity, of it, because that was the other thing, that the nodes were, the outsiders at the party, going back to that myth, where Rahu disguised himself as a god in order to drink some of that Amrita because the gods didn't want him to. So they're always like the outcasts, the party people who invade you or something like that.
Okay.
And
So that gives another, I mean, I like, in terms of how you guys were trying to convey how the nodes are conceptualized in Indian astrology and explain those significations to Western audiences, it's interesting then hearing some of those associations. So with all of this, it's like when I ran into all of this 10 years ago, I decided to take the nodes out of charts and stop using them for a while in order to rebuild my understanding of them from scratch, because I was concerned that there were too many separate traditions that were treating them wildly differently without much overlap, and that there were too many assumptions that were being made about how important they were and what kind of cosmological or religious undertones were being attributed to them in terms of saying that it definitely had to do with past lives or what have you. So I wanted to take them out, and then I've only started to reintroduce them gradually over the years in order to try to rebuild my understanding from scratch. And I think that's a good thing to do in terms of not making assumptions about things, but instead trying to, now that we have access to all these different traditions, figuring out how to reconcile them as one of our great challenges as astrologers, and how to maybe integrate them carefully or deliberately while also paying attention to other things like empirical observation of like, what do these things actually do in practice, or what do you see show up when the nodes transit over a certain point, or what have you.
Yeah, that's a whole other episode.
Yeah, and the other major area, and really the main area where I use them at all at this point, is just with eclipses, because that is the primary thing that they're connected to is the eclipse cycle, and that's a valid additional way to use nodes. And I know that eclipses is something you've done a lot of work on as well, right?
Yeah, with the nodes. I also wanted to say that, especially in Phaladeepika, when he was talking about transits, as I was saying, that the nodes tend to do well or better in 3, 6, 10, and 11, when he talks about the transits in a whole sign house system, of course, like as you do, either from the moon, because the moon is very important. You do it from the moon or from the ascendant. So when the nodes transit, and again, just Rahu, he doesn't mention Ketu transit. When the node transits the 3rd house, the 6th house, the 10th, or the 11th, they give you positive outcomes. So, I mean, again, you have to take everything into account, dashas and transits and everything else that's going on, perfections. You throw in perfections too. And then you can get something. But as a general rule, that's what they say. And, I mean, the eclipses are something... in terms of my predictive work, I mean, I think eclipses on a mundane level and on a natal level, I think that eclipses are probably one of the most powerful things. Again, that's a whole other episode. But yeah, I do a lot of work with the nodes hitting the eclipse point, because the nodes are part of the eclipse, and when they activate the degree of the eclipse.
So really quickly, what is that? What's the nodes hitting the eclipse point?
So when you have an eclipse, you have the nodes very close to the eclipse, and the degree, if you take the degree of the eclipse, the node either hits it hits that degree prior to the eclipse or after the eclipse. So oftentimes when the node kind of hits the same degree, or a planet, you can get Mars, Saturn, things, happen. So for instance, if you take the last eclipse of December 14th that we had, the node came to that eclipse degree in September, so that was because it was a total eclipse. So between September and December, when you looked at things, it was actually on the degree of Donald Trump's moon, that eclipse. So that was one of the things that, I kind of saw that something was going to happen in September that was then going to, in December, kind of have its resolution or something like that. And indeed, in September, what happened in his chart is that the node, the south node, was crossing his moon. And again, I'm doing sidereal with a whole sign house system. So in that system, he has moon Ketu in the 4th, and he has Rahu sun in the 10th on a very exact, almost lunar eclipse that he was born under. So you had the south node hit the moon and Ketu, and then you had the north node hit his sun Rahu. And he had a great achievement in September on that 10th house because he got the Amy Coney Barrett into the Supreme Court very quickly. But then he had Ketu going through his moon, which was the ruler of his 12th, and that he got COVID in that period too. So there were two things. And again, I look at that as the country, because the president is always representative of the country. And then the eclipse occurred on December 14th. And what happened then was that was when they certified the ballots, which was a very interesting phenomenon this year.
Yeah, that was huge. That was the big,
it was amazing, wasn't it?
eclipse thing that was the most impressive this election cycle was that on December 14th, there was an eclipse, which was tropically in Sagittarius, which is in Joe Biden's rising sign. And that was the day that the Electoral College voted and certified that he had won the election, basically. And it was on Donald Trump's moon and Ketu, and activating that. And, that was one reason. I don't make necessarily predictions publicly, but, and also because I have to watch my own politics and make sure that that's not influencing, my astrology. So it's very hard. I think it's a fine line that you walk if you're making public predictions. But I think what happened then, the interesting thing was it went right over his moon, and the moon was the lord of the 12th, and it was in the 4th. So it was like the loss of the 4th. And just as an aside, somebody many years ago, I don't remember who it was, I believe it was an Indian astrologer, told me that when you're predicting elections, and don't look at the 10th house. Don't look at anything that has to do with what somebody is going to get. Look at the 4th house, because the person who has malefics in the 4th has to move. Right. So if they're an incumbent and they have this, malefic force on their 4th house, they have to go. So it's kind of interesting. But those are the kind of things when you're looking at the nodes, that something starts and finishes. And even with pandemics last year, December 2019, there was a solar eclipse, December 26th. And then when Ketu and Mars together, so when Ketu-Mars, because Ketu is like Mars, so when it transits together, it can give very explosive things. They were conjunct on 9/11. And then last year, they were conjunct in February, March, when we had the real pandemic all over the place. And that activated that eclipse in December, which kind of already was, having the pandemic in China. It was already there, So there's all I can go on and on about that, but that'll be another episode. Yeah. And Lisa and I did an episode on eclipses, interpreting transiting eclipses based on what houses they're falling in your birth chart in episode 215. So people can check that out if they want to learn more about that. I think we did a pretty good overview of the astrological tradition and some of the different traditions and ways that the nodes were dealt with traditionally prior to modern times. In the Persian and Arabic and Indian astrological traditions, and to a lesser extent in the Greek astrological traditions. So thank you for doing this with me. I appreciate it, and I hope it gives people a broader perspective, or at least some avenues for research for understanding the nodes better. Where can people find out more information about your work and what you have going on?
Yeah, they can just go to my website, ronniedreyer.com, RONNIEDREYER.com. And I'm always teaching Indian astrology, but also you can sign up for my newsletter on that website. And I do a newsletter once a month, at least I try to. And, I talk about current planetary weather and conferences and things like that. I probably am speaking at a few conferences coming up. One, the Great Lakes Conference in July. And I'm speaking for the Hartford Astrology Group, which now, because it's Zoom, you don't have to be in Connecticut. I'm talking about fixed stars, and I'm doing a workshop on predictive techniques, which will include dashas and eclipses. So,
Nice.
Listen, I'm so happy to have done this, Chris, because we have been talking about this for so long, and I love your podcast. I mean, I don't listen to all of them, but I do listen to a lot of them, and especially because it means a lot to me. Also, because I was on Jackie's original podcast, who you got this from, Jackie Memkis, and I was very friendly with Jackie. So I was very happy when you took it over, and you also, really kind of expanded it so much. So I've been listening to you since you took it over. So anyway, I do appreciate it. And I know we just touched the surface and there's a million things that we didn't say, but that just shows you the depth of the topic, and I think it's great. People can do their own research,
Yeah, well, I think a little 2-hour episode covering 2,000 years of history is pretty good, and I think we did a decent job. So, there maybe there'll be follow-up episodes. I'm sure people will have comments for us below the video version or on the podcast website. So feel free, people, to leave comments there. And I guess that's it for this episode.
Yeah, just one thing. Mention Adams, because Adams was really great when you talked about the eclipses on that podcast. Which podcast was that? What number? I know you mentioned it in the.
It was episode 127.
Yeah, that's good to listen to.
It was titled "Unexpected Lunar Nodes Discussion with Adam Summer" back in October of 2017. So there's no video version of that. There's just an audio version, but you can find that along with a transcript on the astrologypodcast.com website just by Googling it or looking it up at astrologypodcast.com/episodes. All right. I think that's it. You've got to go give a lecture on the nodes for an online conference today.
Yeah, in an hour and a half.
So I'm gonna let you go, but thanks everybody for listening to this episode of the Astrology Podcast, and we'll see you again next time. Special thanks to the patrons who supported the production of this episode of the Astrology Podcast through our page on patreon.com. In particular, shout out to the patrons on our producers tier, including Nate Craddock, Marin Altman, Thomas Miller, Catherine Conroy, Michelle Marilot, Christy Moe, Ariana Amour, Mandy Ray, Angelique Nambo, Sumo Kopic, Nadia Habhab, and Issa Sabah. For more information about how to become a patron and get access to bonus content such as early access to new episodes, visit patreon.com/astrologypodcast. Also, special thanks to our sponsors, including the Northwest Astrological Conference, which is happening online May 27th through the 31st, 2021. Find out more information at norwac.net. The Mountain Astrologer magazine, which you can find out more information about at mountainastrologer.com. The ISAR Astrology Conference, happening August 18th through the 22nd, 2021. More information at isar2020.org. The Honeycomb Collective Personal Astrological Almanacs, which you can find out more information about at honeycomb.co. Also, the Portland School of Astrology, more information at portlandastrology.org. The AstroGold Astrology app, available for both iPhone and Android, available at astrogold.io. And finally, the primary software program that we use on episodes of the Astrology Podcast is called SolarFire Astrology Software, which is available at alabe.com, and you can get a 15% discount with the promo code AP15.